Thanks for joining us today here at the Aspen Institute. And it's a pleasure for me to be part of this conversation about the important role that cities can play in opening access to capital. So as Jennifer said, I direct a program here called Field at the Aspen Institute. And she mentioned our mission is to advance business ownership as an economic opportunity strategy. We're actually part of a larger policy program here at Aspen called the Economic Opportunities Program. And the work of EOP, as we call it, is to advance promising strategies, ideas, and policies to help connect low and moderate income folks to our economy. So we do a whole bunch of work looking at the role of work and wage employment and helping people to connect to and do well in our economy. And then we do a bunch of work on the role that business ownership can play. And that work on business ownership we've been doing for about 25 years here at the Aspen Institute. We do a lot of work working with organizations that are working on the ground with entrepreneurs. And we also do work, a sort of broader research that tries to sort of assess what are the issues that underserved entrepreneurs are facing when they go into the financial markets, what are the broader issues and trends we're seeing in terms of entrepreneurship and how that relates to underserved individuals. And I will say the way that we really generally think about underserved individuals, we think about people of color, we think about women, we think about immigrants, we think about people with disabilities, the folks who are the most challenged to find the resources they need to grow their businesses and to start their businesses. So I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about both, sort of what do we know from the sort of the broader research out there, and then a little bit about what we've learned about some of the things that work to sort of help tee up the conversations today. And one of the things I would note is that earlier this year we put out a paper that looked at the connection between business ownership and the racial wealth gap. And we have a one-pager in the back that gives you some information on that paper and how you can find that. And one of the things I'm going to reference is there's actually a new data set that the census has put out, in part with funding from the Kauffman Foundation, called the Annual Survey of Entrepreneurs, which allows us to look at least what's happening with employer firms, which are firms that employ at least one other person in addition to the owner. I'm going to reference some of that data as well as some other data sets. So the first thing I want to say, just in terms of looking at overall trends, is that entrepreneurs and women are actually starting companies at higher rates than women. Than men, than whites, and then white men. So generally speaking, we're saying in terms of business starts, it's really entrepreneurs of color and women who are driving a lot of the starts of new firms in our country. And the one exception to that is there was a decline in business starts or business ownership among black men in the years right after the recession. I think that's partly has to do a lot with what happened in the construction industry, where there's a pretty high concentration of firms owned by African American men. The issue is that while women and entrepreneurs of color are starting firms, their firms stay small. So they're generally small, both in terms of revenues and in terms of employees. And so the real issue, I think, that we want to, in particular, dig in on is this issue of how we help businesses grow, not as much how we help businesses start. And I would say this is not just a racial equity issue. I mean, in the U.S., we are seeing declining rates of entrepreneurship overall, particularly in some communities. So if we are going to solve the problem of sort of dynamism and job creation and growth in our economy, we're going to have to focus on those entrepreneurs who are creating businesses, and those are entrepreneurs of color and those are women. So while not everyone wants to grow their firms, we know some things about firms that do grow and do survive. And that is that the primary factors in their business success are access to capital, and particularly the amount of startup capital they're able to secure. Education and knowledge, and this just isn't necessarily formal education, it's also about experiential knowledge about business ownership. And networks and connections are all three really important things. And to some extent, these factors are all somewhat interrelated when it comes to accessing capital for businesses. So as we think about this issue of access to capital, I think there are a few things that are really important to keep in mind as we think about entrepreneurs of color and we think about women entrepreneurs. The first is that the racial wealth gap and the gender wealth gaps create a serious issue for entrepreneurs in terms of both their ability to invest in their own firms, which is the number one source of capital for startup funds, is people investing in their own firms. And also in terms of their ability to access external capital, because if you're going into the debt markets, people want to see what your contribution is, and they want you to put up collateral. So just a little bit of data. In 2013, the median net worth of white families was more than $141,000. For African American families, it was $11,000 median net worth. For Hispanic families or Latino families, it was $13,700. So you see how much more constrained as a group, African American and Latino families are to invest in their own businesses. And if you look at the gender wealth gap, and the way we look at that is we have to look at single women and single men, just because of the data sources. Single men have a median net worth of just over $10,000. For single women, it's about $3,200. So generally speaking, women have about 1/3 of the wealth that men do. And then if you break that down by race as well, it's much more dramatic. So I think, we're talking about for African American and Latino women, they have about $100 median net worth. Yeah, it's an issue. So that's one big issue to confront when you think about accessing capital. A second one is credit score, which is a particular issue for entrepreneurs of color. And one of the things that's interesting is that Kaufman Firm Survey did some look at what are the differences between firms owned by, in their survey, between entrepreneurs of color and white entrepreneurs. And the two major indicators where they differed were on wealth and credit scores. And this is not just about having bad credit. This is about not having credit at all. So it's not the case that someone's had credit and they haven't performed well on it. A lot of this has to do with not having enough credit to be able to actually generate a credit score or to be unscorable. So recent research by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau found that about 30% of blacks and 30% of Latinos are what they call credit invisible or credit unscorable, which is they don't have enough credit, they haven't had recent credit to be able to generate a credit score. And one of the things that's concerning about when you think about that in the context of entrepreneurship is that for most folks, like if you look at this by age, this rate of credit invisibility is really high when you're like 18, 20, because you haven't had a lot of credit. And then it goes down over time, and the curve goes like this for whites. But for African Americans and Latinos, the curve goes down and then starts to go up again when you look at the folks who are like 35, 40, 45. For blacks and Latinos, that curve starts going up. You get higher rates of credit invisibility. And those are exactly the ages when people start to create businesses. So most folks, they're in the labor market for a while, they generate some skills, some experience. That's when they start their businesses, 35, 40, 45. So I think that's a concerning thing to think about. Another thing to think about when you think about accessing credit or accessing loans is that there is a small business credit gap generally. It's smaller, it's most intense, less than $100,000, but pretty much exists, particularly below $250,000. And that's because these are really below $250,000. It's not a very profitable product for banks. It costs them as much to underwrite a $100,000 loan as it does to underwrite $1 million loan. They don't make much in interest and fees. It's not a big profitability product for them. They don't really want to make it. According to the Fed's most recent Small Business Credit Survey, however, 55% of the businesses they surveyed that were looking about whether they were looking for credit, what they were looking for less than $100,000. And 75% of them were looking for less than $250,000. So exactly the amounts that people are looking for credit in are the kinds of loans that banks are least interested in making. And given that entrepreneurs of color and women are generally lower revenue firms, they're probably actually looking for in higher percentages for small amounts of credit because there's only so much debt they can service. It's also important to notice that as you get to those lower, smaller loan sizes, it's more likely that entrepreneurs are leveraging their personal financial situation, their personal credit scores, and their personal wealth to access capital. So for example, the third most common source of startup capital is business credit cards. And in fact, blacks in particular are more likely to use business credit cards to finance than I think they're like 3 times as likely as white entrepreneurs to use business credit cards. Business credit cards are underwritten almost exclusively on credit score. And as an aside, they're also generally higher priced than a traditional sort of collateralized loan, installment loan. And what's interesting from that annual survey from entrepreneurs is that black-owned firms are 3 times as likely as white-owned firms to say that the cost of capital that they've received has affected their profitability. So that cost matters as well. Let me talk a little bit about equity financing. That's something I know a little bit less about, but there are many others who know more about it. But I want to just throw a few things out there to sort of set the context. One is that if you cut, and Kaufman did this, they cut the annual survey for entrepreneur data geographically, and what they saw was that DC is a relatively weak market for equity and for angel investing. So there's a lot of places that are weak. Most of it's obviously in Silicon Valley, but still, even relative to some other major markets, DC was relatively weak. What's interesting is that DC actually does fairly well in terms of crowdfunding. But that's overall levels of sort of venture and equity financing. We also know it's particularly challenging for women, for people of color to access equity capital. And this is an area where this issue of connectedness comes in, because it's a lot about who you know. And people tend to invest in people who are like them. And so the fact that most of the venture capital in this country is sort of controlled or invested generally by white men has made it challenging for women and entrepreneurs of color to access equity. And I think there are some really interesting things happening in this country to try to get and invest in more sort of venture angel firms, get more investing going among women, among people of color, so we can direct capital in that way. Just let me finish with a few thoughts about sort of some solutions or where we might want to go as we think about solving this access to capital issue. One is that I think when you're talking about access to capital, the intentionality of the lender or the investor really matters. So we've seen that lenders that have a commitment, deep commitment to reaching women or to reaching entrepreneurs of color just do a better job. And in some cases, that's because they're a mission-related investor. In some cases, they're maybe a minority bank, and that's the target market where they've really chosen to focus. But we've seen this really makes a difference. If you look, for example, at SBA lending, the level of lending to entrepreneurs of color is much, much higher in the programs that are predominated or run by nonprofits and mission-led organizations than by traditional banks. That's also a function of the size of lending, I think, but part of it, I think, is intentionality. And I think that matters for any kind of capital you're talking about. The second is the role that the role of community development financial institutions is important, and we have to think about how to grow them. Not only do they have the mission commitment, but generally speaking, they are more flexible in how they approach issues of credit. So they're willing to look along a credit score to look at how someone manages their financial obligations more broadly. They're willing to be more flexible around collateral, particularly at the smallest loan levels. And the other thing is that many CDFIs and many other community-based organizations have the ability to work with entrepreneurs about how to build their credit so that they are sort of unscorable or invisible. There are products that they can work with them to use to be able to build their credit score. I know Marla nodding her head here because she can talk about that later because her organization does a great job of that. The other thing I would say is that while access to capital is really key, it's also important to balance access to capital with a focus on fair and responsible lending. And we know that particularly people of color in this country have been victimized disproportionately by predatory lending. Since the end of the recession in particular, we've seen a lot of non-bank lenders entering the small business lending market. Many of them are operating online, but not all of them. And some of those new lenders are offering good products that are responsible. They're able to, because they're operating online, because they use technology, they're able to reduce the costs of lending, which make it a better product for them. But some of them are offering some products that are very high cost and have some really problematic features and are essentially like payday loans for small businesses. And they're often serving borrowers with weaker credit profiles. And so we are concerned in the work that we've been doing to follow the market and think about how to address this issue, that they are disproportionately targeting entrepreneurs of color and probably women as well, just because of the profile of the customer that they're looking at, regardless of whether there's anything sort of discriminatory in what they do. It looks like they're probably seeking out that target market. So I think cities can play a really important role in educating local businesses and about what's happening in the market. We've seen some cities do this. And for the district in particular, there may be ways, I don't know a lot about how the district thinks about engaging in and regulating commercial lending, but there actually may be a regulatory role as well that might be worth exploring. So I hope that just provides sort of a quick, useful context to the conversation today. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to the wonderful Melissa Bradley to get into our next panel.
Thank you, Joyce. I want to thank Jennifer for including us in this opportunity. We are all thrilled to be here at Aspen, and it's nice to look out. I can say this because Jennifer knows me. It's probably one of the fewest times this room has been this diverse, so thank you, Jennifer, for inviting us over to change the landscape of Aspen. So I really want to acknowledge what Joyce has said, and I think the entrepreneurs that will speak today are very familiar with that. And having been doing this work for 20 years as an entrepreneur and an investor, now working deeply with entrepreneurs, there is certainly the data element and the quantitative piece, was also the qualitative piece. So we gave questions, but I'm going to switch it up a bit, because what I find here in the DC metropolitan area, I'm just adding two more, is the presumption, right? We read the data and then we assume that applies to all. And so the $100 net worth, that doesn't apply to none of the folks we're going to see today. And that's a good thing, but it doesn't mean they don't experience the same challenges. But I do think it's important that we own that that is a data set, that there are exemplars, because if we don't, what we're finding is all lenders assume all black people that come in are going to have that problem. And so I want to change up, and we're going to start with Bernadette of Pink Utility. Everybody's bio's in there. Bernadette has extensive years of experience in construction. She rules this town. Everybody knows who she is. But share a little bit about your business and the trajectory around what you've done. Because I think we assume because we can't get access to capital, our success rate is limited. And for all of you sitting up here, that is not the case. So tell us a little bit about your trajectory and some of your accomplishments.
Okay, so one of the things that I have done, I do heavy civil construction, heavy male-oriented white males who often, when I first started, came in the room, thought I was the secretary. But I've been very strategic in how I learned the business and how I've positioned my business. I joined National Utility Contractors Association, which basically has all the major business owners that do site utility construction, so I could know the owners and they could know me. I've also completed mentor-protege arrangements with engineers, because I'm not an engineer. I'm a business person who owns a construction company who has learned more about civil engineering from my crews and from the other business owners as getting familiar with the industry. So I think you have to be strategic about how you position yourself. I think you have to be strategic about the partnerships that you form in order to kind of isolate yourself from being a victim of some of the statistics that we heard today.
And what is the largest project you've been a part of?
The largest project that I have been a part of so far is the Clean Water Partnership, which is the P3 in Prince George's County. They are going to retrofit stormwater for about 8,000 acres. It's $100 million, and it is an 8-year effort.
All right, girl.
Yes. So that is important just to put in context, because there's a distinction between friends and family and when you need money to grow. So thank you. So Kia is architect extraordinaire, also design, has done a lot of work in affordable housing in DC, but is now moving into market rate. So tell us a little more about yourself and all that you've accomplished.
So my business is, I like to say, a socially conscious business. We believe that interior design is not a luxury for a few, but a standard for all. So I strategically founded Determined by Design to focus on affordable and supportive housing. Similarly, I don't like the middleman. DC is a city of middlemen. So for me, I went directly to the developers who were doing affordable and supportive housing and saying, you need to elevate the spaces for your projects. They don't look good compared to the market rate counterparts, and I can help you do that. And they were like, girl, you just picked the drapes. You're not really relevant, right? So then I had to realize I had to speak their language and find out what was important to developers in the district doing affordable and supportive housing, looking at how development deals get financed, pro formas, where budget money comes, how does it get filtered down to the last soft cost on a large development project, but has the biggest impact. And then able to do that, one of the examples I was talking about earlier today is on a large development project, I came into the project and we ended up having 7% more architectural finishes, but still cost for cost. I came in 4% under budget than what the original architect specified. So I made it look good, which was my goal, but the client's goal was to save money. And I think Melissa and I have been talking about recently, like, Kia, all right, this is mission, I like it, but is that going to make you money as a small business owner? And you have to diversify. And I do have prior market rate and hospitality experience. So now it's kind of shifting that narrative to, look, if I can design a space with no money, what do you think I could do with the money? So whether it's a market rate building, your corporate office space, now that's kind of how I've been strategic in growing my business.
Appreciate that. And last but not least, we have Monica, who's with Innovators Box, who has transformed, I would say, the general corporate space, but certainly really linked in to the National Minority Supplier Development Council with both services and products. So tell us about your business and what you've accomplished so far.
Thank you. Excited to be here and being able to share perspective. To echo what the two wonderful female entrepreneurs have already shared, I think sometimes when we see stats, it doesn't really speak volume to what happens in real life. And to share my experience, for instance, my company, Innovators Box, we're a creative education business, as Melissa has highlighted, on redefining the workplace. And so in my case, I work across different generations in different sectors. And what I found, in addition to the similar challenges of finding the right buyer and helping them understand the benefits, because of the type of services that I provide, unless we're in certain situations, it's hard for the buyer or certain communities to understand the impact. And I found that partially at times when I might be in a situation with someone else who has a similar thing, because of the biases that come into play, I am not often in across. And so my strategy as a result, understanding that I work across from Gen Z to baby boomers, but also knowing that at times I have different type of buyers. And that was part of the journey that I've had to learn through. And so Melissa has mentioned about the National Minority Supplier Diversity Council as one route. I found that for me, in addition to understanding the ultimate buyer, which is often the leaders who understand what workshops and facilitation or speaking need that they may need for their company culture and development, but also the type of people in between, because I'm looking for not just one team's change or one individual change, but company-wide change. And so my approach has strategically been of not only trying to meet the leader, but meeting the middle people as well as the employees, because I need to understand the three cycle. And that's why, as a result, for my business case, working in other diverse business owners as well as different communities, such as that minority business group, has been a great way. Not an easy route. Still a lot of bumpy roads. Happy to share more on the concrete challenges, but definitely learning all those different avenues had to take part. Now, the thing that I think people forget to understand, unless you're going through that route, is how much cost and time it still takes. I've been in many conversations where people would say, well, Monica, like, that's great, you're doing a great business. Well, these are the resources, you should check it out. Like, I think it's, almost in a way, it's your problem that I haven't figured out that system. I'm like, well, I understand that. But the problem is that, especially as a small business and an early stage business owner, you don't always have the capital to go after that. And when you calculate the time and the investment, you start to question, does it make sense for me to run after that if I can spend that same or maybe less money to find a client? And at times I might just choose to get a client and not understand and investigate all these other capital axes. And I think that's something that we forget in the access flow that I would like to share insights. So.
I think that's an important point that people underestimate. There's an opportunity cost, particularly for people of color. Having gone to Georgetown, I had friends that raised money in one phone call, and it was from their friends and their family. But that is not our case, right? We are probably taking 20 to 30 times. So I think understanding there's an opportunity cost, which ultimately could limit our growth, is something to think about. So I want to ask, we'll start with you, Kia, one word that would describe your experience in raising money. One word.
Uneducated. Uneducated.
Uneducated, okay. Monica, one word.
Hard.
Hard. Bernadette.
Frightening.
Okay. All right. We'll start with you. Why is it frightening?
I think if you want to do something other than using your personal credit cards, putting up your house, having your family mad at you, You have to spend a lot of time looking at what is out there that is non-traditional. Again, I put pipe in the ground, so a small job is $250,000. That's not family. The bank,
Not your family. It's
yeah,
somebody's family.
right. And the bank will take quite some time and a lot of paper to get to the yes. So you look at non-traditional sources. And to the stats that were quoted to us, there are a lot of companies out there that will give you the money, but are you going to survive taking it? So you do a lot of research and a lot of searching, and eventually you find some people who rise to the top.
Say a little bit more about the cost, because everybody may not know that industry in particular.
Okay, so there are some lenders that will give you the money in a day, but your cost is going to be 28 to 30%. Well, at that point, you only got 70 cents out of $1 that you get from them. And that may make the difference between making your payroll, getting your materials, because again, the payment cycle in the construction industry is often 30, 60, sometimes 90 days, depending on who that customer is. So if you're going to go the non-traditional route, you have to be very aggressive about negotiating your payment terms with your prime or your suppliers. But you also have to be equally as careful about the terms in which you take the non-traditional money.
So now we've got opportunity costs in terms of pursuit, and then real capital costs in terms of obtaining it. Okay.
Yes.
Why uneducated?
I think for me the biggest I'm a creative service-based business, so I'm automatically thinking, because I don't have an app or something. No one's gonna want to give me any money in the first place. How do you sell? I want to make a space pretty. You know what I mean? So
Particularly to affordable housing.
so wait, you will make a space look pretty for development that doesn't really make a lot of money. So for me, it's kind of like I've shied away from that. To this point of, we were just talking about this before the panel, and you were like, you need to get a line of credit. I was like, I'm terrified.
For the right place. For the right place.
I'm terrified that I'm not going to be able to sustain that. I don't want to take on debt because, like the stats say, in my personal life, you add student loan, credit card debt. I don't want to do to my business what I've done in my personal life, so I've just stayed in the dark about it.
We're going to work on that.
Okay.
Hard. Why do you say that?
Hard, in addition to everything that's been shared, I feel the cost of getting there and knowing that it's such a small percentage makes me not want to even try. And as a result, every conversation about that feels hard. Every conversation and understanding about that feels complicated. And once it feels complicated, I feel like, okay, what can I do without understanding that and still make a success? I have so much bandwidth I need to figure out, and every challenge I'm solving is complicated for a good reason. But if financial part becomes a complicated conversation and having that conversation is not going to reach its conclusion, then I don't know if I should be in that conversation in the first place. And so it makes me feel hard because I don't even know what conversations to start with who, because if I have the wrong conversation, what if I backfires? Like that is hence terrifying and feel uneducated on top of everything. And so I feel every conversation around that feels hard and something that I unconsciously want to avoid, which I know it doesn't help, but hence why I feel hard about it.
And I would say there's a piece that you talked about that I want to pull out, which is if you make a mistake. Right, I mean, DC is a relatively small town. There's probably less than one person we don't know in this room, which means if you screw up, all of us are going to hear that you screwed up. So I do think that there is this cost of brand, right, and reputational cost, that when you go out there, there aren't a lot of places that you can actually go and ask questions, because the assumption is when you enter the door, you actually know. So I want to ask each of you, if you could change anything about the current capital landscape, what would you change? So this is your chance. We got Deputy Mayor Snowden in the back. Look, everybody turn around. My boss is here. Oh, snap. And then we have DSLBD. We got DEMPED, Quasi-Tech Council. So what do people need to do? And we're going to start with you. And then we're going to
I think that we need to be more open-minded about how we assess the entrepreneurs that are asking for the money. For example, if I've already done 5 jobs that exceed $250,000, why are you asking me for my house? I have a cash flow. So I think you need to use some different parameters on how to assess whether or not I'm a credit risk from a business perspective.
I'm going to piggyback on that. While I haven't done 5 deals at $250,000, it's very, like, I was in the process, I'm in Anacostia in Ward 8. I was trying, great Ward 8. I was trying to get office space on MLK, and this was prior to the boom now, and everything was so black and white that it just stopped me in my track, and I'm the kind of person like, there's always a yes in there, but it was just no after no, just because of the metrics and the criteria were just so, check this box, this box, this,
Ridiculous.
you didn't check it? Regardless, nothing, we can't do anything for you. And to me, that was very frustrating, and I had the numbers and growth in revenue from my business to say, hey, I'm making some money.
So what's the question?
So what's the question?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay. Monica?
I would emphasize on the opportunity cost. I think that's something still neglected significantly. I completely understand there's regulations, there's rules, and there are boxes that you do need to ask, but I still ask into consideration, do you understand when you provide those information, you say it's available for everyone, who are you talking to? Where are you sharing that information? How are you communicating that? Because you're already probably excluding certain communities by sharing it a certain channel. Not everyone's going to be looking, let's say, on social media when you're sharing that and say, hey, I've already done this marketing and like talk to the newspapers. Not everybody's probably looking. So I ask for you to reevaluate some of those aspects when you really want to understand opportunity costs, and ask, communities who are already actively speaking, and ask them what are better ways to change maybe those opportunities so it doesn't seem so costly to even be interested in the first place, because that's the number one barrier that I think often stops.
Please, go ahead.
And one more thing, if you could provide I think especially if you're in a creative or service-based business, seeing examples of how other businesses have been approved for capital, I think to me that would be really beneficial, because I don't see those success stories unless it was a tech or an app or something like that. How does a service-based B2B business really access capital?
And I would second that in saying just other business examples in general outside of tech and app.
Again, I think it has a lot to do with the deal. So oftentimes when I'm approached or want a bigger deal, explaining to my prime how we can get a bigger deal done with their assistance and suggesting to them what the assistance is kind of shocking to me. It's actually offensive, because I know they have done it with other companies, and I think they're very surprised when I make those recommendations to them. They're like, how did she know that? Because I've been in the room with the people and watched them do it.
But the other piece you bring up too is language barrier, right? I mean, I
Yes.
know when we talk to folks about capital and we start talking about cap tables and conversion rates and convertible, the eyes glaze over, because there is indeed a different language
Yes.
that creatives, construction, product folks, that's not their thing. So one of the things that, and I think I can say that Deputy Mayor Snowden and I and others in the administrative had conversation about, is sizing of the market, right? Because assuming there's going to be something great that's going to come from this, right? And probably within the next 12 months. Part of this is understanding who are the entrepreneurs, right? And if we look at some of the data, it may undersize what the market may be. So I want to ask a question. What are your 3-year goals, and how much will it cost to fund it? So I'm going to give you a minute. And I asked that question because at Project 500, we ask people what is their plan, and we find that because of that data, we oftentimes underestimate what our own potential is, because we believe we're going to go after what we can get. Right? We are very fortunate to work with LADC, who is absolutely phenomenal in getting this done, right? But we know that many CDFIs can only go to a certain cap, and so we find ourselves trying to match what is available as opposed to what's needed. And I think in a place like DC, which is equity weak, you don't have that same flexibility of capital stacks to really create a solid and sustainable pathway of capital. So, 3 years, what are those goals, and what's it going to cost you? This is your chance to go big or go home. I'm afraid I'm going to come back to you. I know, right? The city may not have enough money for you. Kia,
3 years.
3 years, yeah.
In 3 years, Determined by Design will be a 5-person design firm in the district, but also have projects in other economically challenged and growing communities, and bringing in revenue of $1 million.
And how much do you need to get there?
I don't.
Because you could bootstrap it. I mean, your trajectory so far, right, has been, I can say, has been you
Yeah,
borrowing,
hustling.
hustling, whatever. But if you didn't have to, because there's opportunity cost, there's missed opportunity, there's people coming in leapfrogging you, just a ballpark number of what it would take to get there, and maybe a year and a half as opposed to 3.
Conservatively, I'd probably say about $500,000.
And that's not a lot of money.
See?
In the scheme of what is available, that's not a lot of money. Monica.
It's hard.
She's sticking with that word.
I'm sticking with that word. I'll start with the goals because I like goals. And within 3 years, we would have started some international projects. I have already been traveling to different cities doing different projects for corporations. We would like to have been, we would also be like a 5-team full-time, have 2 different office spaces, and have been named and recognized for the work we do. If you need a creative culture problem that you need in corporation space, our name's always quoted within to being the problem solver, and hence as a result having worked with at least by 3 years, at least 10 major Fortune 500 firms who thought that was impossible. And financial wise, hence, if I can have at least probably, this is hard. Can I think a little bit more?
No. Because you're going to think yourself down and minimize. What's the
Yes.
number? What's your gut number?
My gut number, I feel 800.
Put it out there, 800,000.
800,000.
Okay, awesome. Bernadette, because your number will be way. What are your 3-year goals?
I think it's conservative, Melissa.
Okay, all right.
I am already getting ready to start a professional services division, so that's going to need to be funded. My guess is the projects that the mentor and I are looking at is going to require an 8-person team, PEs. They have to be engineers. And I'm pursuing an entirely different customer aggressively in the dry utility space. And that too is going to require professional engineers. So the number is $1.5 million.
Okay. Well, people in this room could write that. Where's that?
Okay, well then step up.
There's a couple people on that, but the problem is they can't write it as debt, but they could write that. They could write that. The other piece, though, and then we're going to wrap up, is part of what, at least I know I do this work, and Jennifer and I had this conversation, and there's some people in the room who really care about this. It's not just about the business growing, but it's the impact on the community. And Kia, you were very clear from the day I met you, this is about the community. So in addition to the money, you gave persons, but how many jobs do you think that's going to lead to, right? Because at the end of the day, this is, for us here in DC, this cannot just be about investing in an individual, but how do we really solve for some of the other workforce issues and challenges that we have, particularly when only big companies come in. So how many people do you see yourself hiring in that 3-year trajectory?
So I see full-time employees. I see in 3 years, I see myself hiring at least 5 different employees. And I am always right now very, very specific. You either have to be a woman of color and you have to live in Ward 8 in Southeast. So those things I'm very adamant about. Some people might say it's to my detriment, but then when I look at the projects that I've done right now, I have touched over 650 units of affordable and supportive housing in DC, and how that affects the worker in the district. I had a woman, she was a domestic violence survivor, and when she walked into the room when it was done, she said, Kia, when I walked into this room, I realized change was possible for me. So I have impacted her life, how she views her wealth and her worth, and how she's going to go out into the workforce in the district as well. So that's how I make my impact. And for me as a business owner, I'm all about overhead. So while I intentionally want Determined by Design to be a 5-person firm, our impact reaches buildings and communities. My community that I live in.
Monica, how many jobs are you talking about? Because you have part-time and full-time folks.
Yes, I have part-time, full-time. I would like to have 5 full-time. I probably envision having probably another 5 or more part-time, but similarly to the impact, I've always seen my business model with B2C, B2B, and product, and so the community part has been a core part. And in fact, I have a lot of people who first discouraged me for spending so much time with the community because that's not how I'm going to generate revenue. But I also realized without helping communities and different individuals across different generations understand how they can be creative regardless of their job title and industry and whether their company supports it or not, really helps them be empowered. And so it's really exciting to see how individuals come and share that they never thought they can be creative because of the passion they have in certain industries. And so my goal is in 3 years to be able to reach not just nationally, but internationally, to show that impact, that you don't have to feel buried by a job title or industry. And so I don't have a number because I'm weak with numbers, but hopefully by billion by then, because we're reaching thousands or more at year 1.5.
Impact.
I think 50 people, and I think for me, it's about the number of crews that I'm going to need to accommodate the projects that I'm chasing. I also think the nature of small businesses, I can speak for myself, and most that I know, we tend to hire people that other folks would not give a job. So they've had a hiccup, they've had a bruise, they've had this or the other. And I'm very clear with the people that I hire, both white collar and blue collar, that, everybody's going to make a mistake. And the biggest mistake is not admitting it and having me find out through some other method. So a lot of our employees have been incarcerated, which is why I went into construction, because it's incarceration friendly and it pays a living wage. And they get a skill set that even if they don't work for me, they can go and work for someone else and be gainfully employed in this town.
So what I've heard you all talk about are opportunity cost in pursuing funding because it's hard, language barrier, reputational cost to think about, and cost of capital, particularly being small businesses, but I also say women and people of color. What I'm hearing is recommendations around evaluation criteria changing, a little more flexibility in both what it takes to get, but also managing costs, more case studies, and I would even add the ability to assess your impact. There is a gentleman who is in our cohort, our high growth cohort now, who's making over $5 million. He went to get $1 million line of credit. They required his house. And then said and told him that he was not stable, not because of his money, but because he only hired formerly incarcerated persons, and they did not believe that they were going to show up to work. So if you don't remember the stats, which you should, at least remember these stories, because I would dare say these represent what is possible in D.C., and with barely, maybe $3 million, which we know we probably procure on toilet paper, we could indeed change the lives, and certainly communities east of the river, and employ a lot of people. Thank you, ladies, very much.
Thank you.
Investment committee, so it's probably better.
In
to see my
addition
notes.
to the remarkable stories of these extraordinarily brave, thoughtful, and determined entrepreneurs that we have here in the district, we learned that it is really smart to have Melissa Bradley as part of an event, and it is really foolish to set yourself up to follow Melissa Bradley as a moderator. So I'm going to work to overcome that. We have a great panel here. We have We have Marla Bolanek, Executive Director of the LEDC, the Latino Economic Development Center here in DC. We have Brian Nagendra, the Assistant Director of Catalyst Funds at Living Cities. We have my dear friend Pam Lewis, the Director of the New Economy Initiative of Southeast Michigan in Detroit. And we have Sean Escoffery, Program Director for Strong Local Economies at the Surdna Foundation in New York. So, Sean, I want to start with you.
Right in.
One of the things that we talked about in our previous conversations is this notion of intentionality around inclusive economic growth. When you heard the stories from Kia and Bernadette and Monica, what kinds of intentional strategies that you've either seen or that Certina is working on would be kind of a good fit for what they were talking about, that raising money is hard, it's hard to be educated around it, and it's just terrifying?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. Intentionality is absolutely key. We need programs that are focused on women of color. We need programs that actually value women and women of color. That when you walk into the door, that you are accepted, embraced, and acknowledged for being innovators and job creators. That's not always the case. So at Certina, we're looking at sort of opportunities across the country, different organizations that are trying to sort of walk that talk. We're supporting some work in Atlanta that's looking at Black and Latina sort of tech entrepreneurs. Great group, a sector that is extremely hard to raise venture capital. We're also looking at CDFIs that have explicitly that focus. So not that it's an add-on, because I get a lot of add-on, and as a funder who's very interested in innovation and inclusion, everyone wants to add a inclusion lens to their work because they look at me as, this sort of dollar sign. Mm-hmm. We can add this, but I'm looking for groups that it is part of their DNA because they're coming to the conversation differently. It's important. It's part of their metrics. It's important. It's part of how they operate as a business. So.
Marla, you looked at me. Did you want to jump in on metrics?
Just want to, not necessarily on metrics, but on this question of intentionality, just because it just struck a chord what you were saying, Sean, around the add-on piece. So our organization is 26 years old, and our name is Latino Economic Development Center. And one of the questions that I get all the time is, would we ever change our name? And we absolutely would not. We want our community to know that we're there for them. We want them to know that they can be received by people who look like them, who speak their primary language, and I really bristle sort of at that, let me just put a little Post-it note on my regular services so that I can, seem to or purport to be facing, but I did appreciate that comment. That's all I wanted to say.
So Pam, talk a little bit about how NEI in Detroit has kind of played out that notion of intentionality in terms of what it is that y'all are trying to do for Detroit and how you've been able to do it.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so New Economy Initiative, it's kind of a strange project that sits between national and local foundations like Certina, Kellogg, and Ford, and then NGOs like your organization, Marla, that are helping entrepreneurs on the ground. So we're strategic grant makers. We compiled quite a bit of money to make grants to NGOs helping entrepreneurs. And we've always had this intention of inclusion throughout our work. Now, unlike what you guys are talking about, we tried a different approach. And we're learning from that approach that it was a decent approach, but not necessarily a great approach. What I mean by that is we wanted to socialize the conversation of inclusion around any type of incubator, accelerator, procurement program, venture fund. And so we began the conversation with our grantees using that leverage of our grant dollars. How do you think about inclusion? Who are the people you're serving, but also who are the people you're hiring? If you, as an early stage seed funder, start to diversify your own staff, that also impacts how you see the people coming to you. And so we've done it this way for about 7 or 8 years and have seen really good numbers in terms of the types of entrepreneurs that are being serviced by the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Detroit. Where we've been tracking it, about 45% of the businesses that are being started are being founded by people of color. But you have to also peel back, the types of businesses we're talking about. The other thing that the learning that we've had is when it comes to capital and access to mentors and markets that help businesses really grow and scale fast. So these growth companies, we find that it's still a challenge getting those types of opportunities in front of people of color and women, but particularly people of color. And so we're starting to rethink should we be focused more on identifying and activating organizations that are targeting those groups? We have Access Growth Capital, which is in our Middle Eastern community in Dearborn. We have Prosper Us, which targets, minority business owners. Sometimes because you're in Detroit with small business, that's a given because you're talking about a city that is, 90% people of color. But when you're talking about innovation-led and high-growth businesses, it becomes a different conversation.
So just to clarify, I think I heard you say that one of the things that has produced success from NEI in amping up opportunities for women and people of color is that the people on the giving side of the table and the people on the receiving side of the table have some experience, some diversity in common. That if you are trying to do this work without diverse funders, without diverse people in government, it will not go as far. That's been your
Absolutely.
experience.
And I think this is the beauty of philanthropy in this space, right? I mean, some would say, what's the point of why is philanthropy dealing with economic development? For a city like Detroit, necessity is the mother of invention, right? I mean, we have a need for people in our community to have jobs. We have a need for those jobs to not wait on the big corporates all the time, but how can we influence entrepreneurial paths? And so philanthropy took a very deliberate step and used that purse to socialize values of inclusion and also collaboration. And then create different types of tools and products. You talked about the cost of capital. You talked about the fact that, credit visibility is low, median household income is low. What are some tools that philanthropy has sourced to make that ladder, not that first step, not so high? $250,000 is a crazy amount of money, but philanthropy has filled in the gap in Metro Detroit area with the Entrepreneur of Color Fund, or using the CDFIs to do small business lending and other funds that we've partnered with Living Cities on to make the rung of that ladder lower, particularly for entrepreneurs like the ladies that you just met.
Okay. Brian, when we had a preparatory call, you said something really pithy, which is that doing things differently means doing things differently. Talk a little bit about how Living Cities is, like, what's different? What is the different that needs to happen, and why is it hard to make that change?
So thanks again for having me. And one of the ways that I know that we're doing things differently is if I feel uncomfortable. And so there's some part of having the conversation explicitly about what each of, in our team of Living Cities, what each of us bring to the work in terms of who we are, having that conversation and being explicit about it, how we hire, who our vendors are. So it starts a little bit with having vocabulary to talk about some of these issues more explicitly, bringing intentionality to how we do our work at different levels. And so one of the ways that we're doing that is really trying to be good about starting with the networks and relationships that we have and building from there. So with the New Economy Initiative in Detroit, Living Cities invested $1 million in a fund that started as a $3 million fund looking at can we prove that character-based lending, so lending without your 3 years, your credit score, or a weak file maybe, is possible, it is less risky than perceived, and what is actually that risk? Let's find that out. Let's have money to test that. And that was built on work that we started in 2011 with relationships, and longer, frankly, philanthropy's role in relationships. So a lot of what we do is that if you're going to build it, don't do it alone.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Talk a little bit more about some of the metrics that you guys are working on, this notion of character-based lending, and why it's powerful, and what are some of the important elements to know.
Sure, and you could probably
Yeah,
talk a little bit about this
Talk
too.
amongst yourselves.
Yeah, so one of the things that Brian is talking about has to do with a network of support providers that are already in place helping businesses start and grow, and so which has been invested in by philanthropy. And the experiment is if you have microlending at a certain level between $5,000 and $25,000, and you have these businesses that are working with these business support providers, that business support provider becomes kind of the representative to vouch for the character of that business owner. And so it's not a random program where it's just whosoever will let them come. They actually are coming through business support organizations that are on the ground that know these entrepreneurs and are working with them on a daily basis.
Because in building that, one of the things that we're really conscious of is that access to capital is important, and you definitely don't want to be in a place where you've given access to capital to someone they're not going to succeed.
Right.
Because
You could
that's
break a
worse
company too. Doing that.
than before, but also that's just part of that conversation. So the relationship piece is the way that we mitigate when we don't have it all on paper.
Marla, yeah, how does
I
that
would
work
just
out?
add that, you know, sort of what differentiates us the most probably from banks is that we do have a lot of time invested with our clients and we develop relationships with our clients. So the power of that relationship is incredibly important to getting to the approval. You know, I often talk about, you know, like every interaction is, you know, either a moving forward in the character line or moving backwards. So if you didn't disclose some information, and we always say from the outset, you know, we have seen it all. So there's nothing that you could say that would surprise us or that would, you know, make us think less of you. I mean, this is life, and we've approved people who have, you know, been through the ringer and back, and there's really, you know, nothing that anyone should feel shy about disclosing to us. But sometimes people do withhold information, and you know, part of our loan officers' jobs is a private investigator. I mean, they're looking to find out as much information as they can to build the case to approve a deal. And they're also building that with the client. Often our clients don't have financial protections. They'll sit down with our clients and, you know, work through that. And over time, the relationship is built. So I think, unlike a bank, which is just sort of spitting out an algorithm as a yes or no, kind of like what Kio was saying about her experience, it's like just black and white. If you don't check these boxes, then it's a no. You know, for us, over time, we're developing a relationship where we can really vouch for a person and really say, you know, we have full confidence that this person is going to be able to succeed on what they're putting out there. And I would also agree that oftentimes people come with us with financing requests, and once we've worked with them, that financing request that they originally came in would have absolutely broken their business. And so sometimes part of our job also is to refine the financing request so that it's aligned with their capacity to repay and their capacity to generate revenue that would be able, well, that is the capacity to repay, but yeah.
So to continue, Marla,
Yeah.
when I think, you know, I hear from this panel that there's a lot about entrepreneurial support organizations like yours. What's the role of government in creating that environment or supporting entrepreneurial support organizations? And I ask this because I'm somebody who really loves government and thinks highly of it, and one of the worst things that government can do is things that it's really bad at, because that undermines, oh, and one of my friends from DC government is nodding her head, because that undermines people's trust in government, and there's an opportunity cost for government not doing what it can do very well. So what's government's role in this infrastructure?
I mean, I think a supportive role, obviously the government supports us financially. I mean, our biggest funder is the Department of Housing and Community Development, so big ups to them. I mean, I think where it can go right is, you know, being supportive both from a financial perspective, but also, you know, from a regulatory perspective, from a legislative perspective. We've worked with council members to push through legislation that supports, you know, and advances what our businesses need to be able to succeed in the city. I still think there's a ways to go. I'm always concerned when agencies try to take on direct services that nonprofits are providing, you know, themselves. I don't see a lot about that. I think the biggest challenge from the small business support side in DC in particular is that there are multiple agencies involved. And so I worked in New York City for 7 years in partnership with SBS, which is their Department of Small Business Services, and it's just one place that you go if you have a concern, or, you know, or if you're a provider, that's the entity that funds you. Whereas in DC, you have DSLBD, you have DEMPED, you have DHCD, you know, you have Ms. Snowden, you have, you know, a lot of different people
and
involved.
We love you all.
Yes. And I've, you know, knocked on all of those doors, but I guess the difference is versus New York, which is my frame of reference, is that was one door.
Sean, you were nodding when Marla was talking. What do you think government in the cities that you've worked in, what do you think government does well, and what should government hand off or let other people take care of?
Well, so I'd say our work is trying to make government work better. So I'm not sure if anyone's doing an incredible job. You know, we're all trying.
The field is open, DC.
But our work is to support the sort of the creation of an ecosystem. The challenges that businesses face is there's 10 different doors to open, and usually we don't know how to open them in the right order, who's providing what capital, what level of technical assistance, sort of access to this sort of contracting opportunity. So what we're trying to do in New Orleans, in Memphis, and in several cities is really trying to galvanize and formalize an ecosystem so that you can navigate, a track successfully. I think government could be helpful there in terms of just creating, a one-stop shop essentially for businesses, but that's a little bit harder.
Pam, what have you seen government do?
Yeah.
And in Detroit, I understand it's a little bit of a different context, but generally.
We always think we're different, but we probably aren't as different as I think we are. On the state side, and Patty can probably speak to this too, when it comes to tech commercialization and innovation-led entrepreneurship, there's been a lot of investment coming from the state Michigan Economic Development Corporation. They have their funds. They've been supporting a lot of the non-governmental organizations, helping those types of entrepreneurs, working with universities to advance that. On the small business side, though, within the city of Detroit, we have a very creative mayor. And I'm going to get it wrong, but he's been using CB, Community Block Grant.
CDBG. CDBG.
Right, those. Yes. He's been using those, and some of us we were like, okay, what are you doing? What are you doing? Because, so for example, I'll back up a little bit. Any ideas launch a small business challenge. This is another way of non-traditional capital, is doing it through challenges and competitions. And we use the model that you see usually on the tech space to do a small business challenge to get $10,000 grant dollars to businesses directly, using the charitable purpose clause, because we're in a community that's 45% poverty. So we feel like we have enough, if we can help that business, we're helping the community. And then we give $200,000 grants away to businesses that are larger. So over the last 4 years, we've probably given $2 million away through that program. Well, the mayor jumped on that too and started his own challenge that was centered around how do you activate businesses that are going into retail spaces. So it was not just about supporting the business, but it was also about bringing life to a particular commercial corridor and using the CDBG dollars to do that, along with philanthropy subsidizing it. And it's been, but again, he's leveraging this network of service providers he's not trying to duplicate how these businesses get support in order to get through that process. He's leveraging the network of service providers to support the businesses and accessing how to apply to that challenge and what they need to do to activate those funds once they win them. And so it's been fascinating to watch. On the flip side of that, though, it still is difficult for businesses in Detroit to efficiently get started. And so that's, sorry, Mayor Duggan, but that's an example of...
We'll edit this part of it.
Yeah, but that's an example of the mayor's office getting in the business of these small business challenges and still needing a ways to go in terms of making the normal processes and practices of the city efficient for a small business owner. Mm-hmm. So it's a pretty delicate space.
Yeah, one of the things that I've noticed is that governments are very aggressive about creating programs on the give side, right? Incentives or funds, but then they don't necessarily always go to the back of the house and look at what's our zoning regs? What's the average time for a business permit? And it's important, I think, to have that full. You can't give with, well, it is frustrating for people if you give with one hand and take away with the other. And so I think that's another role for government. And Joyce had mentioned previously looking at notions about predatory lending and consumer protection. So in some ways, a lot of this economic development and growth stuff is pretty much the bread and butter of government. And so if they can do that well, that will have a good effect.
But also procurement, I mean, that's another space because, the best way to grow somebody's business is to get them customers, And so the role that a mayor can play in convening the business owners, the corporations in their city around how they may intentionally procure services from business owners that are in their city is another role that government can play as a convener and as a person that can pull that together. We've seen that happen in Detroit as well. The Detroit Economic Growth Corporation has a procurement program where they worked with Quicken Loans and Henry Ford Health Systems and Blue Cross and got 17 companies to the table, DTE Energy. We will work to procure everything from the hot dog buns that the hospital is going to use in their cafeteria to technology, to cleaning services, to whatever, plumbing and construction, to intentionally do that with local businesses. And their spend in Detroit has increased significantly because of it.
So Brian, you've been taking notes assiduously. I'll ask you a question, but if you want to say something coming out of
I think Pam, the piece about being a convener is really critical. We so Living Cities, we launched something called the Integration Initiative that tested out what we think is a different way to make just the work move faster in terms for better results for low-income people.
And what is the work?
And so for each of the cities that participated, in 10 in total, currently 5 are active, they set their own goal. So what we focused on was how the places were working so that they were engaged truly with the public sector. We think instead of saying something is broken or somebody else is to blame, you engage them. That bring together a cross-sector table. So if you're actually talking about changing an ecosystem, you have everybody in the room. Using all types of capital, so both grants, loans, foundation loans, public dollars, commercial debt, bringing together all the resources to the things that we think they should be spent on. And the last piece is sharing as we go. So the longer-term evaluations are critical, but sort of sharing what's not working and what is working. And so in that, the different cities, there were different people who led the work. And for the cities that had a public sector lead, it sat in the mayor's office, the economic development office, we absolutely had the widest participation in that place. There was absolutely trade-offs where when that mayor left, handoff was a problem, and that in Newark, that changed when Cory Booker left in a different way than in some other place where it worked, where the transition was more successful because they anticipated it in Baltimore. And so the convener role is very big, but it's also the setting the stage and stepping back and being the facilitator in that. And so I think here, sort of setting up this conversation, coming from a 5-year plan is like part of the inertia is right? So setting that stage and continuing to listen, So
does government have to, when government acts as a convener, and as Pam has called out, there is a premium on collaboration. Does government have to be willing to endure an extra increment of criticism from the people that it's convened? Does government have to be willing to listen to Melissa Bradley say, "This is not right, y'all"? So how does that work?
And so I'll say I'll put myself up on deck here, but for foundations, yes, right? Okay. So whoever's providing money or resources, if you're saying you want to change, it means something's not working the way you want it. And so what that means for the engagement session, so in Baltimore, there is an investment we're doing around Johns Hopkins University was the lead, bringing together a consortium of banks that hadn't done this kind of community development investing work before, and they helped set the stage for building sort of a group that that is now doing community development work and sort of setting the stage for the work, but the planning effort that led up to it. Now I got my thought again. The planning effort that got to it was a 3-year effort that was extremely broad, but it takes it's still taking the funders and the city to hold them accountable to that effort. They had a listening session, now it's time to do the work, and there's practitioners and folks that are experts at it, but continuing to bring that back is part of, I think, the accountability.
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I'm
no,
kind
please
of
do.
laughing over here because, you know, with the 13 foundations that we work with, and then we work with these network support providers in a collaborative way, I concluded that criticism is a synonym of collaboration, which is why people don't like to do it. Because if you're going to collaborate, you have to open yourself up to criticism because, you know, if it ends up being something that you don't quite want, it probably means it's a better idea. You know, because if everybody's coming in and everybody's, either you're going to get nothing of what you want or you're going to get something of that is a little bit of what everybody wants.
Yeah, you remind
So-
me, we in raising these collaborative phones, I think I have a line that I think is true, and my team usually laughs at me about saying it, but collaboration is great except it sucks. And so there's some pain to doing things in a more sustainable way.
Okay, that's very tweetable, by the way. Collaboration is great, except it sucks. Brian Nagenda.
Yes, attribute that.
Thank you, 18 Atlantic Cities funders.
One of the things, Pam, you know, you talked about in Detroit, the challenge is to fill retail space. In a city like DC, I think that there's a different market pressure on retail space. Marla, talk a little bit about the small business challenges that go beyond raising money to being able to keep the lights on and the doors open in the places they are in a city where the real estate market is rapidly changing.
Yes. So this is my personal obsession. So if I go too long, please just cut me, or I'll just try to wrap it up into a little nutshell. But so I've spent the past couple of years looking at national models for business retention. Because we had found for a lot of our clients that as corridors become gentrified, they are inevitably pushed out. They can't afford the rents. They can't compete with the new, the newer businesses that are coming in or the bigger chains that are coming in. Just to give an example, we this past year did an initiative on Georgia Avenue Northwest, which is to me the final frontier in Northwest DC for gentrification, and it's I think the second to last place where a Walmart went in DC, and that set off like a spur cascading effect. And so I think just, I don't think it's just cities or governments, but I think people tend to gravitate toward something that's new and shiny and sexy, for lack of a better word. And so it's much more interesting to talk about getting behind like who's going to be the next Google versus how do we keep Joe Schmo corner store open that's been there for 25 years and that is an integral part of the community and the fabric of the community, but that isn't the next hip happening hotspot. So that's something that we're really working hard toward. I don't know that I don't know what the solution is, and that's part of sort of why I've been looking at what's going on, anywhere from San Francisco to Martha's Vineyard to Montgomery County, Maryland, to just try to see what nugget could apply best to this environment. But it's just something that I feel really passionate about. I think it's worth the attention. And Deputy Mayor Snowden has kindly given me audience to this idea, so she's heard it before. But the one thing I can say is that we've helped council draft, one council member who's in the affected ward of Georgia Avenue to draft some legislation around rental assistance for small businesses. So that could be a response. We'll see. We'll see if it goes through.
Sean, I know you also have strong feelings about businesses being pushed out by gentrification.
Yes. So we were looking at commercial land trusts, taking the sort of homeownership land trust concept and sort of using it in a commercial space context. In New Orleans, they're trying it. It's still hard to make it pencil out, but looking at perhaps ground floor retail and a multifamily development, stuff that has a bunch of different, new market tax credits and light tech and a bunch of subsidies that are layered into a deal already, and then trying to create some permanent affordability. We looked at the work in San Diego with Jacobs, and they did a community public offering. They built a shopping center, and the community, the regular, average Joe or Jane was able to buy shares in the shopping center. And as a part of the shopping center, there are spaces that were sort of designed for community businesses that will always be community businesses. They have the traditional chain stores in other spaces, but there's always a couple spaces that are meant for someone, an entrepreneur from the community. It's been really hard to make those businesses work. There's still sort of been turnover. If the $1 billion that we have at Cerna, if it was my money, like personally, I probably wouldn't be here. But I would, I think foundations should actually invest in real estate. Should actually buy real estate. It's a good investment in changing or emerging markets, but we don't want to hold real estate, for whatever reason. I think there are times you can actually get ahead of the curve. We see what's happening in cities. We've been talking about Anacostia for, almost 10 years, maybe, right? In terms of like, oh, it's gonna change. So and now it's changing, and now it's too late to buy it. So I think, in terms of being able to take risk, we do need more funds that are willing to take risks on purchasing and holding. The challenge, though, is if you subsidize a business, there has to be sort of a term or a sort of time limit, because you could be subsidizing a business that would just normally fail. And failure is not a bad thing. The majority of small businesses or startups fail, so it's a learning process. So there's just that little bit of tension between wanting to make sure that the business stays there, but having the capacity to actually grow and to address its challenges. Why does it not have the right financial systems in place, the right marketing? Is it not in the right location? Those are some of the questions.
Do most cities have community development corporations? Pardon my ignorance on this. So I think of Midtown Detroit Incorporated, or in our city, Grandmont Rosedale, CDC, and the use of their role to secure properties and activate and curate those properties within the context of their neighborhood, funded by philanthropy. And I'm just wondering, is that common in other?
So I live in Brooklyn. I'd say the challenge is, like, when the market turns, it steps on anything you've done for 20 years. So, Bedside Restoration Corporation in Bedside, Brooklyn, they've been acquiring properties. They've done a ton of commercial development. Brooklyn is hot. And, that group might have not even been there because the market just completely took over. Snatched everything up.
And so, Marla, how is this playing out in DC in terms of what do you think that's working well in terms of supporting small businesses in this rapidly changing landscape that people should sort of secure and build on? And where do you think, based on your research, DC could maybe go a little further? And then I've got one more question for the 1.5 more questions for the
Well, I think just the fact that there's interest alone is a huge plus, because some of the markets that we've looked into, this isn't on their radar. It's just not something that people are talking about or thinking about or caring about, I should say. And so the fact that it's something that has gotten into a bill, and it's something that people are having conversations about, and I think also the fact that residents care about it. But I do think there's more room for supports. I've always said, coming from New York City, which was a very workforce-oriented city, DC is a very housing-oriented city, so it's just harder in general to get entrepreneurial topics in front of government agencies. It's just not the priority, and I get that. And I completely understand how people can feel that housing is much more of an important right to humanity than the ability to start and expand and grow a business and stabilize it and keep it going. But I do think that there is some interest there, and I think just the more that it can get. I mean, that's part of why I participate in things like this, is to get the word out. But yeah, I mean, I think if there could be more mirroring of what exists on the housing side to support small businesses, whether that be rental subsidies or, just like there's a first-time home buyer down payment assistance, could there be a down payment assistance for commercial purposes? Again, I think what's challenging is like none of this is like, no one's going to run their platform for reelection on like, I got rental subsidies for commercial tenants, so that's the tension that we're playing with. But.
So one of the things that Kia and Monica and Bernadette seemed to ask for was this notion of storytelling, right? We want to see more stories of how businesses like ours grew to success. What are some good resources? And Pam, I know that NEI has put a lot of effort into that storytelling. Like, what are some good resources for storytelling? Because even if it doesn't come from DC specifically, these women are all entrepreneurial. They know how to take a situation from a Detroit or a Baltimore or Atlanta and use it to draw on. So what are some of the good storytelling resources that are out there for business development, particularly small business or creative-based businesses, not so much the tech?
Yeah, and I think this becomes, there's storytelling that an individual business does to get their story out. That's different than what I'm going to speak to. It's the storytelling that a city government or in that city could do to get the story of the collective out in terms of what's happening and what do those entrepreneurs look like, which is very important. And so we've been doing that work of really working hard, because here's the thing: a lot of times when you Google entrepreneur, people in this room, you never see people that look like the people in this room, right? But we're finding a different reality in our city, but still the narrative of, those are just the hipster white guys, still persist when it actually isn't just the hipster white guys, and we love them too, right? And so it's not an either or, it's an and. So we've been working hard to identify entrepreneurs and dispelling the myth that an entrepreneur in Detroit is a hipster white guy with a nice groomed beard. It's him, and also that the entrepreneur in Detroit that's a minority is not just the cupcake shop, which is great too. But there are, not even just app developers. There are people figuring out solutions on fluid blood flow for sickle cell, and finding those stories, using small media companies within the community to curate those stories, whether it's through a website or whether it's through different, we do these high growth happy hours where we look for successful entrepreneurs in the community, and we invite other entrepreneurs, and they come, and then you tell a story, they share their stories with each other, and you tell a story about that. And it starts to show that there are people that look like the people in this room that are doing great things in the city. And now we're trying to do that in a way where it's not just focused on the external audience. It's nice to come to DC and talk about the work in Detroit, but for the average 18-year-old kid in Detroit, he's not going to be at Aspen listening to this. So how can we also frame it so that he hears about it and can see himself in that story? So those are some of the tools that we've been using. Again, it's a non-grant making role that anyone could play in the city that is doing it on behalf of the entrepreneurs, but not them doing it for themselves.
Brian, real quick, what are some of the storytelling tools that Living Cities uses or has available?
So in terms of one of the things that, as we're thinking about systemic change, so if we're starting to make a big effort in organizing in DC, how do you want to change the folks that you're saying aren't doing the right thing, right? And so instead of saying the problem, but sort of asking the question, why aren't you investing? And what will it take to get you there? And actually, more specifically, have that question. There's some of the investments we work with, there's a sense of once we pilot it, somebody else will pick it up. But if we don't actually have the question with the commercial banks in that place, we're not necessarily providing the right metrics that they're concerned about. We're not necessarily addressing the concerns, or maybe we're trying to date someone who doesn't want to date us, like and
Bad
understanding.
flashbacks right there.
And so asking those questions and really sort of engaging, and so having someone who's bringing together disparate parties is pretty powerful that way.
Great. So in the last few minutes, this is our lightning round. So everybody, one sentence answer. What is the most? You can have semicolons in that sentence.
Don't give us outs.
What is the most important thing that people in this room, or people who are later on watching the video, what's the most important thing that they need to know about access to capital for local serving small businesses? Sean.
So they said it on the first panel that intentionality matters, and I think that is, like, period, the most important thing. Not the add-on. There are groups in every city that have been doing this work. This is longer than a sentence, but yes, intentionality.
Semicolon.
Yeah.
Okay. Funders always get a little bit extra. Pam.
Mine is going to be focused on Bernadette, Kia, and Monica, and I was thinking about, sorry, this is not a sentence either, so I'm breaking the rule. As women, and pardon to all the men in the room, when you're asked for what you need, in my mind, I multiplied it by 5, and I said, that's what a man would have said. So I say to you as women to, don't be sheepish about what you need. And we tend to be too conservative and don't ask for more. And I just encourage you to do that.
Okay, Pam, my next grant application, you are not going to love as much as I am just telling you right now. Okay. Brian.
So as a investor in businesses, so really paid for currently working with primarily investing in organizations, but is to respect that even if you don't agree with a particular business's decisions, that they made them for good reasons, and start from a place of empathy.
And Marla, last word from you.
I would just say to the question that Melissa posed to the prior panel, asking them sort of how they felt toward seeking capital, and they said they felt uneducated, that it was hard, and that it was frightening. I feel confident that those 3 things can be overcome. They're not insurmountable hurdles, and so I actually feel encouraged by their trepidation, because I think all of these are things that people, and especially you all, can overcome 100%.
So thanks so much. Our next panel will be another group of DC-based entrepreneurs. This is focused more on kind of high-growth venture-based businesses. It's going to take a little bit of time for us to get this new group mic'd up. So now would be a really good time to introduce yourself to your neighbor, to somebody that you don't know. Swap business cards, start talking about a deal. That's one of the reasons why we're here.
So I want to thank the earlier panel that just spoke, because I think they raised some significant issues. I told Deputy Mayor Snowden I was being nice, so that's over now. But I do want to address one thing, right? Because I do think it's about perspective, going back to how you use data. So Sean, when you said subsidies, I had a visceral reaction in the back, because the reality is the city gives subsidies all the time to big companies. So I think we have to be careful of the language we use, right? All the big companies that are here, if you dig deep enough, there's something. But why can't we give it to businesses that are here, that are resident-owned, that have been here, more importantly, will be here? And I think the statistic around employment is significant, because data says black businesses hire more black people. And if every black business in DC had the capital to hire one more person, we would have 0 unemployment amongst black residents.
Wow.
Fact. And I didn't say that. Janice Bowler, JP Morgan paid for that research. So I think that it's significant, because I also know source is important. I think it's significant, particularly as a lot of money is coming into DC, that we are thoughtful around that. So I want to take that, right, in terms of subsidy, because I think language is important. And the first panel of entrepreneurs is really focused on small businesses who are intentionally small, who, as you can hear, have very strong and compelling social missions and want to be in the community and for the community. This is a panel of folks who care about the community, but let's be clear, they're trying to be billionaires, and we are supporting them in that effort. But there are those who believe by being able to touch one, you can help one. There are those that believe by touching billions, I can help even more. And so this panel is really focused on those folks who are interested in scale. So I'm going to ask to start the same way, say a little bit about each of you, but also let's continue to change the narrative. We are fortunate that we have several investors in here, like Stephanie, who consistently and intentionally looks for people of color, thank God, but help change the narrative of what you've done so far in terms of bootstrapping and where you are right now, because each of you are doing amazing gang-busting business that equity investors should be looking at. So we'll start, ladies first. So we'll start with Janice.
Oh, excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Janice Omedeki. I'm the CEO and founder of the Mentor Method. Think of the Mentor Method like eHarmony, but for creating inclusive workplace cultures. The way we do that is by connecting diverse tech talent to top performers at companies seeking to hire more diversely. 2-year-old startup, I absolutely love all of the blood, sweat, and tears, although some equity and some funding would be greatly appreciated. Hi, Stephanie. So traction-wise, it's extremely humbling being able to see the impact we've been able to have in such a short period of time. So we've led to 10 to 15% salary increases for our mentees. We've seen people go from, in a 4-month period, go from being an elementary school teacher to a program manager for a large corporation. We've seen young professionals go from being a bar manager at TGI Fridays, who had a degree in graphic design but just couldn't get in, didn't have a way in, to getting a full-time graphic design job with benefits and completely changing their lives. And it's incredible being able to see that. We have amazing partners, including the DC Economic Partnership, as well as Deloitte as one of our flagship corporations. So that's our work. Our team has expanded to 6 employees, as well as 4 incredible advisors that provide support in finance, entrepreneurship, sales, and diversity and inclusion. And we recently just launched an internal mentoring practice as well. So that if there's a corporation that maybe doesn't, so let's say, for example, a large corporation, hopefully Capital One is watching. So for example, at Capital One, their logo gets them enough candidates in the door, but what are we doing to make sure that those candidates within their first 120 days feel welcome and included and actually feel as though they're contributing their story to the overall company culture? And what is Capital One doing to provide a hospitable home for these great innovators that maybe are women, people of color, from the LGBTQ community? So with our internal mentoring practices as well, we're able to help change the voice of that company culture internally.
Shout out to Capital One. Oh, please. Capital One is in the room. Rachel, take that back. Rachel, take that back. All right. Kim.
Good afternoon. I'm Kimberly Moore, and I'm CEO and co-founder of Go Together, where we are really changing the way that parents think about how to get their kids where they need to go. So with the evolution of Uber and Lyft, where we take full advantage of those opportunities, and for families, they can't really do that. And the main reason for that is that there's not enough trust that's built into their platforms. And so while launching a business like that is very capital intensive, what we chose to do is to acquire a software company to help accelerate our growth and start building that trust across the country. And so in 2015, we acquired Carpool to School. It's a SaaS platform that schools subscribe to help their parents build trusted communities so they can walk, bike, or carpool together. So it's been in the market 5 years before we acquired it. We've had it for just over 2 years. There are 41 schools on the platform. wide variety from private schools to public charters. We are in several conversations with school districts across the country in San Francisco, Pennsylvania. And again, there's another level of trust to use even carpool to school for those jurisdictions because the parental community is not as close. And so we're building into our platform another level of trust that would provide a background screening that's equivalent to what parents are accustomed to going through when they want to volunteer in their child's school. So my co-founder, Charles King, and I have been very strategic about how we grow this business. As Melissa said, we do have a pathway to a $1 billion company. We've raised capital, almost $500,000 so far, and with a goal to raise another $1.5 million to give us about a 12-month runway. We want to do some really amazing things with our technology that would make life super easy for parents, but also help their schools be happier with reducing the amount of traffic that's coming on campus, because that's the school's motivation. In addition to, creating value in the relationship with the parents, it's that traffic that's happening in the community. So a partnership with the city could help us facilitate that mass explosion of carpool to school in a public school district because they know what the problems are. And we're excited to be in this space. We're excited to be really the leader in this space. It's a very new category. We are really taking a leadership position right now, and right now at a pivotal place for growth.
So I just want to pause for a second, because probably if you were anywhere else besides Aspen, there should have been an amen corner that you acquired a company as an African-American female, as well as you raised money. So I'm going to give everybody a chance now to acknowledge. Because we can't take that for granted. So that's huge. That's huge.
Thanks.
Sarah.
Well, I don't often get to do this, but how many of you had lunch today? And how many of you think it was better than a catered lunch you've had previously? Great. So plum relish. I like you. For that. So plum relish, we work with better restaurants to change the way people eat in groups. We've been around for just over 2.5 years. We recently announced a partnership with Mike Isabella and his restaurant group. And today we delivered our first Founding Farmers lunch. So I came from the advisory board, healthcare, mission-driven background, and we've applied the same principles to food. And as it turns out, after 1,200 lunches, and we started with the school lunch, it was the first one who said yes. So we serve a private school in DC. It turns out that people want better branded food, and how can we bring profitable and incremental demand to restaurants that need it right now. So, restaurants can't raise their prices any longer. Labor issues are a huge concern. And so we've designed a food product that can scale to say, hey, restaurant, here's the type of food that people want. It needs to be paleo, vegan, gluten-free, list the ingredients, 5 dishes, not too much, not too little. We'll look at your menu, it takes 1 meeting. Here we go, we'll do your sales, logistics, we'll get you online. So we're your plug-and-play back-end catering. So we are somewhat of a service, but we have a scalable tech model. And because we started in our own kitchen, these restaurateurs have said to us, we like you because we know you're scrappy, you know exactly what we need to do. And it's a very different take on what you see out there with like Grubhub and Postmates and DoorDash of this on-demand, how fast can we get you this food, and Crunch Kitchens. It's kind of like the Living Social, I hate to say it, and Groupon of the world, where they're trying to really crush these small businesses with good deals and volume and revenue that's not really profitable. So ours, we provide a profitable line. Where we are with the business, so we actually started with a Kickstarter. I emptied my 401k, put in all my savings. We've raised a very small friends and family. And we are currently raising a seed round, and I can probably spend all day talking about how fun it is. But the good news, I will say, is we've recruited some excellent people. We have fantastic clients. We have great partners. We have even better advisors and mentors. And the missing piece is this investor group. So I'm always happy to talk about why I think that is and where we are. And just as a reminder on my soapbox, thanks for doing this. You know, I think it's less than 1% of businesses start off with venture backing. So, you know, the fact that we're standing up here is to say, is there something crazy about all of us, right? That think that we can build something big enough to change what we're doing, and we need to find investors who match that ambition and want to share it with us. So it's a big strategic decision on how you raise your capital. You know, and I do think we would have died if we were in San Francisco and took money early, because I think it. You know, I'm hoping one day I'll look back and say, you know, those 3 years of like crying were worth it. But where we are right now it's an interesting situation where we're in a great market to operate, but not necessarily in a great place to raise capital, and we're going beyond DC to do it.
Very similar.
Gentlemen, thank you.
So I'm Sage Salvo, founder of Words Live. We're an education and media tech startup built on the premise that we can improve student performance, particularly around literacy, by integrating a bunch of cultural articles, specifically music. So we rejected some of the status quo that the students are just chronically underperforming for reasons of learning disability or general lack of interest or lack of ambition. And we looked at the number of artists that were coming out of these cities, you know, DC, Baltimore, Detroit, LA, Oakland. And we just said, you know, students are exhibiting, they're performing reading and writing proficiency just in very different ways. And what if there's a way that we could integrate some of the things that they've taken to culturally into their classrooms? And so we have been doing programs for about 3 years, but we're about 6 months in to our first technology platform build. And effectively, what we're doing is making it very easy for teachers in classrooms to integrate culturally competencies into their lesson plan. So in 4 clicks on our platform, a teacher can integrate song lyrics into their English lesson plans and help the kids learn how to read and write through song lyrics. You know, it's interesting from a going concern because you got a population that is increasingly diverse. You know, we're seeing it. We know what the 2040 projections are, but we're seeing it right now in K through 12. That you have a population that's majority non-white, and you couple that with 2017's the first year that hip hop was the major genre in music for the first time, surpassing rock. So you have an increasingly diverse student population. I think is ripe for some cultural innovations there. So we've been active, like I said, for about 3 years. But most recently piloting our tech platform in 4 different school districts, bi-coastal, DC in Maryland, and in Oakland and New Haven out in California. We've survived through bootstrapping, a combination of revenue and fellowships. So we've been fortunate enough to get some skills in like writing these grants and doing these applications. You know, we've been fortunate to be like Camelback Fellowship, 4.0 schools, Clinton Global Initiative, Halcyon here in DC, and then getting actually our pilots paid for, either directly from the schools or through third parties. So we've been on that survival train as well. And, you know, looking to scale now, like proving out those concepts, proving out certain features, and now kind of looking to scale.
So I'm going to ask the similar question as you before. So we'll start with you, Kimberly, this time. One adjective that describes your fundraising experience.
Consuming.
Consuming, okay.
Shocking.
Schizophrenic.
It's like a medical health diagnosis.
Eye-opening with the hyphen.
Okay. So I want to have each of you share a little bit about what that has been and who you've talked to, because I think, not necessarily explicitly, so we don't get anybody in trouble, but what have been some of the responses, positive and negative? Because I think one of the challenges I'm beginning to see with minority entrepreneurs is, one, the belief that the companies aren't big enough, but 2, because the data also lower dollars, right? So when you think about venture capital in general, we have we have a lot of money going to very few companies because the belief is that it's taking a lot of money to get there. But the reality is, when I think about knowing a little bit about each of you, what you've been able to do with darn near no money has been pretty spectacular. So a little bit about what that funding pathway has been in terms of types of people, positive and negative responses, and assumptions. And we'll start with you, Janice, particularly because there's a double-edged sword of being a diverse person doing diversity work in what would believe to be a place where money should just be falling out the sky based on the negative publicity and everyone's large commitment to D&I.
I 1,000% agree. And that is why I said it was very eye-opening, because I think, and obviously I'm the CEO and founder of the Mentor Method, so I believe in this. I think that there's I mean, that's not even just thinking. Tech is our beachhead. It's a $4.5 billion market. I'm confident that the Mentor method can capture $314 million of that with our current enterprise models. I know my numbers. I understand the competition, and I understand that, what we're doing is significantly ahead of the current solutions out there. We have the D&I committees of overachievers that already have full-time jobs and maybe don't have the same attention to detail for truly creating these inclusive workplace cultures. Maybe it's just something that they want on their performance review, which is fine, but more needs to be done. Or we have corporate mentoring programs that just match based on things you can't control, like your age, race, and gender. And I recognize that if we're going to do more, if we're going to see, a stronger workforce, the Mentor method is really one of the best ways to do it. I'm not saying that we're a magic wand that will solve the world's diversity and inclusion problems. I think that's unrealistic. But I do think that we are a key contributor in that space. So being able to tell that story using dollars and cents, but also being able to show the traction that we've had, the feedback I receive is wonderful storytelling. It makes sense. Other feedback I've received, simply because of the nature of institutional funding, it's not typically, women of color or people of color. So the comments are, oh, I didn't realize that was really that big of a problem until you said that. And I'm like, well, I'm glad I was able to at least enlighten you, but that check, is it happening? So there's the barrier in terms of knowledge base on, yes, I see that I maybe don't have as many diverse employees on my team, but I don't see why that's an issue because I'm in a position where I can write these large checks. So it hasn't necessarily impacted them. So having to both talk about a highly scalable business and then also educate them on why is an issue. I think being a woman and a woman of color can also be a barrier at times. I'm very proud to be a first generation American from the Congo, but I think sometimes just a lack of awareness and sort of the things that we talked about before. I am not afraid to ask for money in terms of investment dollars. I'm not afraid to ask for exactly what the Mentor method needs. The positive feedback I've received is that I'm very resilient and that I'm very passionate, and I think I'm proud that that goes through as well.
Good. Kim, and if you can say if having Charles, who is an African-American man, has helped or not as well.
It has helped a lot. He's a known person in the DC community. He's a commercial real estate developer. His focus in our startup is really where we're going 5 years from now. So autonomous vehicles, connected cars, and he's building relationships that are in those spaces while I'm really head on with our growth, both in technology, our team, and our customers. So it's really, really helped. The other thing that has also helped is that we both have gray hair. And that means that we know people who potentially have more cash that they can invest personally than a younger entrepreneur does. So we raised almost $500,000 through friends and family. And we're going to have one, in case someone else is interested, we're having an investor dinner in December where we're inviting a small group of individuals, because this will be our last time to do a friends and family round. So it's worked out really well. We've known each other for over 27 years. He's a serial entrepreneur. I'm a person who's got great experience in sales and creating sales channels. I'm comfortable with short cycle sales as well as long cycle sales. I used to manage the federal government division for Verizon Wireless. So all these things sort of play in our favor, but I will tell you that as we've talked to angel groups and early conversations with VCs, early stage VCs, even with our attraction of 41 schools, including the largest private school in the U.S., in the U.S. here, not continental U.S., but and the 15,000 end users that are on our platform, that somehow we are not far enough along. And so that's amusing to me. When I know people who have nothing and are getting checks for millions, right? So it's a hard balance because, I want to be open as a CEO and a founder to feedback, but also want to find the right way to challenge that assumption that we don't have enough traction. And building a great network of people has really, really helped us. Melissa being a part of Project 500, being, as my core in sales and knowing the power of community and staying in contact with people. It's not a one and done kind of thing. It's really a long relationship to get a door open for us potentially. So some of the no's that we've gotten are that we don't have enough traction, that we need to do some work on our business model, although we have paying customers and have had paying customers from the beginning. The other negative feedback is that we don't have a technical co-founder, and some acknowledgement for the fact that acquiring this business and being able to really reimagine the web platform and build 2 mobile apps, native mobile apps, working with other technology partners, that's got some kind of weight that should come to it. We are hiring our director of engineering because we get it. There's a pattern of recognition that people believe that facilitates high growth companies, and that's having a director or a CTO. So we get it. And also, quite frankly, for me to be unplugged from that process because I'm a product owner, run the sales, and managing the technology piece. So I'd need to be unplugged. And thankfully, I'm the kind of CEO that is also a delegator. So I have no desire to only hang on to just my part, the part that I do really well. So we'll do that. But we also don't think that not having a CTO is a barrier for us because we have been able to demonstrate to very prominent schools across the country that we have a platform that works. Positive things have been that we do have traction, right? Also that we know our numbers. We know what it's going to take for us to get from here to there in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. We also know our competition. We know the spaces that we know we need to be connected in. And people have been very impressed with that over time. Since this is a new category and there aren't a lot of people who are in it, there are a few that are coming our way. We want to do some interesting things that really help the parents at the end of the day have a much easier life. We do get categorized into more mission-focused funding, so social entrepreneur funds. But like Melissa said, we know that we are going to be doing good while doing well, but our objective is to kind of do well faster than do. And,
the good will come when you can afford
the good will come. And we know it'll be good. The other beauty of what we do is we help people create relationships. Kids can meet their best friend in a carpool. Parents can create great community through this process. But it's not the driving force of what we're doing. It really isn't. And so it's okay. We'll have those conversations with those people who invest that way because quite frankly, we'd like to be a star in their portfolio, honestly, to demonstrate that by making an investment in a company like ours that we will do very well while also doing good.
Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, one of the, when we started 2.5 years ago, between so I had a co-founder who left the business full-time a year ago. We had a big deal on the table, and when we had left the corporate world, we had managed over $200 million of a business line. So it wasn't small change. And a lot of the feedback we were getting from potential investors, high net worth folks, smaller VCs, was, this sounds like a real business. And I was like, yes, it is, because we came from a public company, and we had to be pretty honest with our projections. And when she decided to exit full time, a big part of the reason was she's like, we just don't have nepotism in our favor, and she's like, that's the key, and that's what we've seen. It's all of us in our own right are persistent to a degree beyond what normal people think they're capable of, because it's tough to keep going when, none of us have odds in our favor at all. So, just a VC-backed company, I think, make it to a unicorn status less than half a percentage point of the time. So by the nature of VC-backed companies, they're never going to get there, and we're not going to get funded. So I think the conversations it's always tough to sit there when you're saying, hey, I heard that if I had traction, if I had this experience, if I did all these things, that I can sit in front of you and you would like bet on me. And so it feels personal when, it may be not be, but it can feel personal. I think it's one part of it. But I had a business partner join full-time who is technical about 4 months ago, and it's changed the dynamic of conversations. And we had a day a couple of weeks ago where we went to 4 investor meetings, a larger VC, a small high net worth folks or whatever. And after each meeting, he's like, you got to talk it up. And I looked at him and I said, if I said what you said in that meeting, how do you think that would have come off? And he's like, oh yeah, that's true. I was like, I can't talk like my best male self. Like, it's off-putting, and he's like, yeah, I hear you. I'm like, so you have to be very careful of how you come across. And the irony in small story is, last week we had this high net worth investor in DC who sold 3 companies, very involved in the tech world. He's a restaurant investor as well, so he understands the need of what we're doing and how we scale, and he loves it. And he's like, yeah, I'll definitely meet up with you guys. So I was like, why haven't you written a check yet? Let's write this check. And he's like, you should talk to that guy. He has like 50 times more money than I do. Like, a lot of what we're hearing in DC is I've parked my money and we haven't been able to get out and we haven't seen the results. Mm-hmm. Fair. So then I get an email from him that says, hey, I want to introduce you to the chef over at this restaurant so you can get started with them. And I said, hey, actually we can't because I don't have the resources. And I'm nervous about just taking on the business that we have. And so I said, we have 18 restaurant groups in the pipeline that I can sign tomorrow, and we just can't do it. And so he wrote me back and he goes, don't get too cocky. And I was just like, cocky? I actually can't do this. Like, this is, So I just laughed and I shot that email off and I was like, he doesn't even know, how that comes across, but I'm begging for resources of course I want to take this restaurant group on, but it's kind of that mentality of, you get what we're doing, you want to sell us, you tell all your friends, where's the check? Mm-hmm. So, mm-hmm. But on the positive side, I feel like we're making real traction. I got a cold call from a big accelerator in New York. I got noticed for a trip to Boston to meet with the larger investor groups. It's just the problem is speed is a weapon for high growth businesses, mm-hmm. and if you don't get that speed and momentum, you can't take off.
That's right.
And a lot of companies like ours die by suicide and starvation from capital and just like if you don't want to put up with it anymore. And I think that's the hardest part that people don't understand. So today's lunch, like I printed labels yesterday. It's all the things that are.
I get to see it as your neighbor.
Yeah, it's very fun. Yeah. So I think out of it though is a real mission. My mission has changed, which is I want to build this really great company, but I will throw checks at people when I have it. Like I will make myself poor just so that they don't have to go through what I did and just be like, here's the check, just get off my back. Like send me the paperwork. I don't care. I never thought about that before I got into this, which I think is eye-opening.
Okay.
Yeah, I have to echo a lot of what you said, especially what Kim said as well. So my experience is characterized by an inherent tension between taking advantage of an opportunity and having the actual resource capacity to fulfill that opportunity, right? So you have investors that say we want traction. Okay, to get traction though, we have to have a certain resource base in place to increase the number of users and core stakeholders that we already have. And so it's just like this circle. Like either I'm going to get capacity, build that out, and then you'll see the traction, or you're just going to keep asking for traction. It's going to take a longer time because I don't have the resources right now. And as an example, I'll give a quick example. We were invited to a dinner out in Silicon Valley. This is just a week or two ago. And the initial conversation is, hey, I want to learn about your metrics. I want to see what kind of traction you guys are going. It's good you got school districts. I want to see. I get out to the dinner, and one of the portfolio companies was there. And so we're seated, we're eating, and I'm asking like, okay, how did you get involved with this investor? And they're like, man, he just saw something he liked in us. So I was like, well, did you have traction? How many customers did you have? He said, and this is, Silicon Valley culture. He said, bro, we didn't even have an MVP. And so I'm just like, what is this double standard thing going? And this is where I say sometimes it feels personal, right? Because it's like, on the one hand, you're asking me traction, but you're investing in people because you like the founding team, or, I believe in the founder. All right, so I'm just like, all right, that's cool, but if your criteria is on such a sliding scale, then it's going to give me that schizophrenic feeling. I don't know where I fit in. I'm trying to answer this, and that's how I characterize my experience.
Melissa, can I just add one thing really quickly? I was just piggybacking off of what Kim was saying too. My background's in graphic design, however, I'm not the CTO. And when I first started the Mentor Method, people told me that I needed a 24-year-old white male from an Ivy League school and feel free to give him at least 60% equity into my company. To which I, politely gave them my networking smile and said other things in my head and kept going. But what I wanted to say, just in case there's anyone here that is thinking about starting a tech company and maybe doesn't have that same technical acumen, the Mentor Method recently received a grant from the DC government, the Beacon Grant, $5,000, and we'll be building out a roadmap for female founders to help them level up their technical acumen to create a tech and tech-enabled company despite not having the title of CTO. So that'll be things including, basically what we're going to do is lay out all of the options that you have as an entrepreneur to get to MVP and hopefully get to your first 5 paying customers, and allow them to feel confident in their decisions, whether that's outsourcing, whether that's going to General Assembly to take coding classes or using another web app, just making sure that they feel confident and equipped. And Melissa will be one of the interviewees for those courses.
And let me note that is worth way more than $5,000, wherever those city people are. You're going to get a greater rate. Yeah, I know. But what let me say is multiply that by 100. But anyway, moving right along. Because I'm looking at Jennifer, and I don't want to cut my man Mac, and certainly not Gavigan. Oh, okay. So what would you suggest to change? And this time we're going to start with you. What should change in general, or specifically in this region?
I'll start general, then I'll go into DC. I had a conversation with an interesting investor, and I think because the building of applications has become so easy, I mean, there are apps to build apps now, right? I think that has caused probably a lot of confusion around what's a better investment than another, right? And even these ideas about traction, if you have a certain amount of social capital, you can fake traction for a while. So I think there may be a bit of just new confusion on a form of an investor about picking the right thing, but I think the same business principles apply. And you have on this stage, but in this community as well, a bunch of entrepreneurs who are both great inventors, but also great managers, because we hire talent, we're grooming talent, we're bringing on tech talent when we need. And I think those are really the nuts and bolts of a great startup. You have the vision to invent something new, deliver it, and then build the resources around it. And I just don't think the ease and the proliferation of all these apps really obscures that one simple fact. And that's a good investment you can build on a portfolio. For DC in particular, deep sigh. I have found, sort of like you, that I need to go outside the region for capital. I think we have, relatively speaking, a more risk-averse investor base. It's unlike other tech centers where you have entrepreneurs and former entrepreneurs now becoming investors, and it's more like government contractors becoming investors. And I just think there's a different dynamic there. So I would like to see more of a partnership between the tech industry, and especially those who have already run companies and sold them and are looking to invest, as more of a marriage with the existing investor base. Kind of move them off that averse scale that we're at now. I think that could hopefully free up some capital investment.
Sarah?
So I wouldn't have said this before I started, but I think there is a bigger role for government to play. Where just looking at it from a capitalist perspective, we work with restaurants, they have huge labor issues. We're not a social impact company, and so there's a lot of social impact funds out there that actually we could do better with if they put it into us than something that's not going to work. I think DC, every entrepreneur thinks that their city needs more capital. So we're not delusional, but I do think that there is a place for better investors at the seed stage. So right now, the seed level funding is at its lowest level since 2010. And there's this massive gap between where we are and Series A. So it's going to be up to us to figure out how to bootstrap to get there. We don't have people who are willing to write checks. I think I'm white, I'm female, and there are funds for female-oriented entrepreneurs and founders, but they may be Series A or they have no money. So they put on pitch contests or something that is just not going to actually propel us. So I think there is an opportunity for government to look at the funds and figure out how can you incent these high net worth folks to write checks, just as you would with a nonprofit, because nonprofits need to be subsidized, and there's no guarantee that they're going to last other than funding. So I think that's one major thing. I think it's having a culture where there are companies where people have money, like these people who've made their money in unconventional ways, like through selling a government contracting company, to become educated on how to put money back into the community with companies like ours. So if people are unwilling to write checks, and they've not operated startups, it's tough to get them to write checks.
I think that the investors and people who look at our deals have certain sectors that they feel more comfortable in: cybersecurity, healthcare. So when you're raising money for, in our case, what looks like, oh, you're helping families, isn't that nice? It's really bigger than that, because I know that when I'm pitching, a man or woman in the audience who has children understands what this problem is. It's real. And so by that alone, that should be an inspiration to really come talk to us. I mean, I do believe that there are some people who have, leveraged their social capital to build up this big story about their tech startup, and then when you go meet with them, there's nothing behind it, right? So I'm saying that's great. Those people are out there. Be willing to be more open, and let's have the second conversation, and let's have the third conversation. And for any of us who've gone through accelerators or incubators, I know I've gone through two, one most recently. It was grueling. So if we made it to the finalists of this accelerator, they had 450 applicants. We made it to the final 25 to 50. If we were able to do that grueling process, then it should account for a second or a third conversation just to see. I'm not saying everybody has choice, and I get it. I really do get it. So I think being open-minded that there are more opportunities in DC besides government, cyber security, healthcare, that really impact the city. And that by having people who have it as a purpose in their fund to be intentional about looking for entrepreneurs who are solving big problems and not requiring anything less at all, but looking for them. We participated in a panel a couple weeks ago about a similar topic, access to capital. And the friends and family round is really kind of difficult for women or people of color. And part of that is because the people who could consider us friends don't have us in their circle at all. We're not friends with them, right? We work with them, but we're not friends with them. So if you don't have the friends and family round that's, inclusive of people that you're willing to invite into your own personal space, if you have no experience with people, women business leaders, women executives, people of color, it's going to be really hard probably for you to consider investing. So it's about being open-minded about that. If you're willing to write a $25,000 check for your son's buddy who, all he is a white guy, and that's it. He's got a really good idea. We want it to be fair, right? Let's keep the same standard, but just be open to the possibility that there are people who are solving big problems and doing it in a way that is willing of investment, desiring of investment.
30 seconds.
No pressure.
None.
What I would say is, if you're going to have a certain standard, like Sage was saying on your website, of traction, education, and team, then use that, or don't use it at all. And if you're not using it towards me, just be honest and say so. It will be frustrating, but I'm an entrepreneur. I can take the hit and keep going. I think that's probably the biggest thing I would say. You know, certified in entrepreneurship from MIT, got accepted to MIT's Global Entrepreneurship Bootcamp, one of 75 ventures out of 5,000 globally to make it. Yes, that is humble bragging, but that's also to say that, you know, the gentleman who is getting $25,000 to put an emoji on a polo shirt, which is one I've actually seen, that hurts my brain to think about that when I know what we're doing. And then the last thing I would say too is, you know, in addition to leveling that playing field, I think that the government does have a big opportunity to work with highly scalable ventures like the Mentor Method, like the other panelists up here, to sort of lift that tide for these smaller boats. You know, let us get onto your backs and help create these sustainable businesses here in DC to start making DC the next Silicon Valley. You know, start making DC screw Silicon Valley, actually. You know, let's make us better than that. And I think that the best way to do that is by partnering with small businesses that will scale, that will create innovation, that will provide more opportunities for others to see, okay, we don't have to move 6 hours via plane in order to be successful. We have resources and support here. So whether that's opening up your pipelines to help our businesses, if you think that there may be a channel partnership, you know, partnering for events, partnering for initiatives, I think that there's a lot of room to play in that space, and I really encourage those of you with the opportunities to do so to please get in the sandbox with us.
So I just want to end that I heard transparency, which I would say either the city's going to help businesses or they're not, but stop saying you are and you're not. You're either going to leverage, so I'm so happy that Mac is here, but you have programs in Virginia and Maryland that are leveraging city funds that we're not, that are investing, which is why many of our entrepreneurs go across the river, go across the bridge. Good for Mac. Validation, I'm happy that John is here to talk about what's happening in Buffalo, because I'm with you. Screw Silicon Valley. I am all down with Buffalo right about now. And I would say if you really don't have the money, which I don't believe, but if you really don't, then be a customer. And not just through a grant, but be a real customer, because that validation, because what happens is you get these small customers, but the government comes in, there is a vetting process, and the validation it provides that you were able to leverage that and punch above your weight class of what is perceived is huge. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. We are in the home stretch, and I appreciate that Melissa and the last panel kept the energy high and the ideas and even the provocations flowing. I think Janice showed us the real power of entrepreneurship when she took 30 seconds and kind of wove it into about 3.5 minutes. That just shows that entrepreneurs can make, you know, you give them a little and they can do an enormous amount with it. She bought time. So this last panel is here to talk a little bit about how the themes that Melissa hit around transparency, leverage, validation, and, you know, if you can't be a funder, be a customer. If you can't be an investor, be a customer, have played out in places outside of DC. Because again, the idea being that while DC has many great companies, we don't have a monopoly on the best ideas.
That's embarrassing.
That's somebody who agrees. They're like, yeah, that's so right. So we have the now famous Mac Conwell, director of the Minority Business Pre-Seed Fund at TEDCO. We have Patty Glaza, who is the managing director at Invest Detroit. We have John Gavigan, executive director of 43 North in Buffalo.
Yep.
Melissa's all about Buffalo today.
Damn, I didn't hear that one.
And Stephanie Thomas, who is the senior associate for investments at the Impact America Fund, which is based here in DC. So Mac, you got name-checked a couple of times.
Okay.
Tell us about how TEDCO addresses some of the challenges that we heard from our DC venture-backed business, particularly focusing on how you leverage existing funds and public funds.
Okay, well, I'll start off giving a quick background about TEDCO, right? So TEDCO stands for the Maryland Technology Development Corporation. This organization has been around since 1998. It was originally a grant organization to help commercialize companies that were licensing technologies from our research institutions. Over the last 20 years, we've turned into a funding institution. And so we are the largest funder of early stage tech companies in the state of Maryland. We do 40 to 50 seed deals every year across multiple different funds, right? So we have a cybersecurity fund, a life science fund, a general technology fund, a gap fund for companies that have already raised their seed and try to get to a Series A. And then we have the Maryland Venture Fund. And all of those are in one bucket, right? They all work together to define these seed deals and these venture deals. And those checks go anywhere from 100,000 to $2 million. But then, I guess about 2 years ago, TEDCO did this internal research to find out how they were doing and what the thought was from the community. And they found out they weren't investing in enough African-American-led startups. But when African-American-led startups applied for funding, they got funded at the same rate. So it was this big question of why aren't we getting more black and brown founders applying for funding? And so TEDCO did what we always tell entrepreneurs to do. We talked to our customers. We had 2 listening sessions to meet with the constituency and find out what they thought. And they were very honest and open and difficult conversations, very tense conversations. And to TEDCO's credit, they took the time to listen. They weren't trying to defend themselves. They weren't trying to say, whoa, we do this, we do that. It was none of that. They really took the time to listen. And 3 things came out of that. You don't look like us, you don't market to us, and I don't have access to friends and family capital to even get to the point where I have enough traction to be competitive for seed investment. And TEDCO's like, okay, that's interesting. So you don't look like us and you don't market to us. We took care of that. Out of 10 key hires last year, 3 of them were African Americans, 2 were African American women. My colleagues, Angela Singleton, who's a phenomenal, successful entrepreneur, has an MBA from Yale. Tammy Thomas, our chief marketing officer, who's an executive at TEDCO, who's also the former chief of staff of Bowie State, and also worked at UMBC when they launched their cybersecurity incubator. 2 very phenomenal women, and there was myself, right? And with Tammy being our chief marketing officer, she deals with making sure our message gets out there to all demographics across the state of Maryland. But then this thing about friends and family money, right? That it was a sticking point there. And so keep in mind, we get most of our funding from the state of Maryland. We get about $20 million every year from the state of Maryland to invest in these startups. And we were trying to come up with this idea of how we do a program for, address this friends and family round. And what came out of it was this Minority Business Pre-Seed Fund, which is actually a partnership with Harbor Bank being a black-owned bank in Baltimore, who is currently becoming more active in the local tech community in Baltimore and across the region. And so they are a 50-50 partner with us. So now you have funds coming from the state of Maryland and funds coming from a local bank to put together this program where we're going to take 10 African-American-led startups over this fiscal year and give them $40,000. But here's where the unique part comes in. You can be as early as the idea stage all the way to the prototype stage. So literally you can have idea down on a piece of paper, all the way up to you have a prototype, you have some customers, but you don't have enough traction for that seed investor to be like, I'm ready, right? And what's come out of that is we've done 2 rounds of funding so far. We've funded 6 companies. 5 of them have been African-American women-led. We finally got 1 guy, so it worked out. And they're phenomenal companies. And what we found through the applications is we've gotten almost 120 applications every cycle we've done. We've done 3 cycles to this point. It's been 320 applications across all 3 cycles, right? And so there's demand there. And we're seeing a lot of great ideas. But the thing that we took the stance on was, I decided we weren't going to care about traction or how far you were. What we cared about was how unique was your idea? Like, is this something I haven't heard 20 times already? And does it have the potential to be a large outcome? So if it's a really unique idea and has the potential to be a large outcome, well, that's interesting. And we find that the entrepreneurs we're investing in are doing things that are just really unique, right? And they're unique because they're so passionate, and it comes from a place of where they feel like they were marginalized. So I'll give you an example. We recently funded a company called PYT Funds. So a lot of people here in the area know PYT Funds. Stacy's been around, right? And so we just gave Stacy some money, but the premise behind the idea of you go crowdfund money for school, and we know you're not going to get enough money to pay for your semester, but then we're going to take that money and leverage it to get you a low interest loan from Sallie Mae, and we'll get an origination fee on the backside. That's different. And then when you ask her what made you come up with that, she's like, well, when I went to school to pay for school, I went into the military, and they paid for me to go to school. My sister, when she went to school, she went into a bunch of debt. So today, I'm doing fairly well for myself, and I'm starting this company, and my sister's still trying to get out of that college debt. So there's got to be a way to fix that. Well, that's a powerful story. That's an amazing entrepreneur. Why is she running around? The only way she can really get funding is Wednesday, Tuesdays here and there, and a bunch of pitch competitions and accelerators, right? Because that's what we have to do. That's what I did when I was an entrepreneur. You go to the pitch competitions, you go to accelerators, you try to pull this money together because no investor's ready for you yet, and you try to make it work. But I think there's a model where we can invest earlier and help de-risk these companies.
So Stephanie, I think a lot of the companies that Impact America Fund has invested in also have that particular market niche driven by experience. So can you talk a little bit about what your fund looks for in a company and how you work on that notion of validation?
Yeah, sure. So at Impact America Fund, we really believe that there are a lot of sort of hidden opportunities embedded in communities, typically underserved communities across the country. So you think about where VC dollars are flowing, the largest cities, reflect New York, Boston, and the Bay Area, right, and Silicon Valley. And so how do we sort of move the needle to reallocate venture capital in a way that identifies companies that can scale pretty quickly, but also are really solving big problems that we know innovators in these communities have had ideas about for a very long time. They just needed opportunity and access to infrastructure that can support their growth. And so with our fund, we're really focused on tech-enabled, tech-based platforms that are looking to scale solutions for low to moderate income groups and underserved groups in the US. We're thinking about how impact can play out from sort of an economic justice narrative around participation. So not just giving people access to high quality goods and services, but what is the participation rate across the value chain in a particular industry, and why does it look the way that it looks, and how can technology sort of disrupt some of that to create more opportunities for people to generate wealth and actual income that's sustainable over time. And so how we think about sort of the type of companies we want to invest in, we're looking for entrepreneurs who typically, have some lived experience within the problem context that they're solving for. A lot of them, the issues are very personal to them, similar to what Mac talked about with Stacy and PYT. We also look for entrepreneurs who can couple that experience and that empathy around the issues with a business savviness, how to really build a thoughtful business model that can be profitable at scale, and that can also have inherent impact in it, so that there's not tension between them making a difference in the community and them being able to be a sustainable going concern as a business.
So Patty, one of the things that you and I have talked about previously is this notion of metrics, and Matt hit on that as well, right? He's not looking as much at the typical metric, but is that a really interesting idea, and is there a large outcome potential? Talk about some of the metrics that you are either using or searching for at Invest Detroit for your fund, and you can spend some time describing the fund.
Sure. So Invest Detroit, we've been investing since 2010, from early seed to late seed. We are coming up on our 100th investment. A large part of that funding coming from New Economy Initiative, especially at the beginning. From a metrics perspective, and I heard what the entrepreneurs were saying from the last panel, and I know it's a struggle, but we have to put in context, especially what Mac was saying in terms of the volume of deals we look at. And if we see 500, 1,000 deals in a year, and put it in context, we received close to 150 applications for our latest fund just in the first couple months. And so what we have to look at the team, and similar to, do they have experience with the problem? Do they really understand the industry they're working in? Are they leaders? So we know early stage companies can't have big teams. You don't have the money. But are you selling a vision where you're able to attract a lot of talent around you as advisors, as people willing to work for equity, as people who are just like, okay, I'm ready to jump on board as soon as you're ready to go. So are you a leader, and really are you selling your vision to other people outside of investors, right? We have to look at metrics from and every industry is different, right? So with user-based if it's a user-based model, I do have to look at how many users you have. Now, I don't really care exactly, is it 50 or 100? But I do care, are those 50 super engaged? Are they coming on your platform every day? Are they doing a lot of activity? Or, and was it 10 yesterday and it's going to be 100 tomorrow? So I do have to see growth. I have to understand what it's going to take to scale. For our funds, what we're charged with is how do we help these companies get to that next round of funding? That A round of funding is looking for $1 million in revenue, and the B round of funding is looking for 5. So how do we, can our little bit of money get you that far enough along to get to that next hurdle, or are we going to strand you? And so we really try to be purposeful and about not stranding our companies. So from a metrics perspective, I look at it is, can the company achieve what it needs to do with our funding, and if there's anything else around the table to get to really that, $500 to $1 million in revenue that then typically enables the next round.
Do you get money from the state of Michigan, or is it entirely philanthropic or other sources?
It depends on the fund. So we've got 3 funds. 2 of the funds have a little bit of state money. Yeah.
So, John, we've got Maryland, we've got Detroit, we've got Impact America Fund has an Oakland base and a DC base. So Oakland, a little bit of that valley slosh coming over the bridge. But how do you create that kind of entrepreneurial venture investment? How do you make a name for yourself in a place that is underserved by venture capital? And is there a role for government in doing that, in putting a place on the map as a venture magnet?
Well, to answer your first question, I can't remember from the first panel, but somebody said intention and being intentional. And I think that is the key word. I love the fact that Melissa was like, be careful of the data. I think we're dated to death, to be honest with you. I mean, we all know the data. It's hard. If 1% of all startups actually get funding, that's tough, whether you're a white dude, a Hispanic male, or a black female. It's hard work to be an entrepreneur, but that's what makes it rewarding and great. So intention, I think, is probably the key word, at least for me. It's the aha statement of today. And yes, government can support that. Fortunately, we have a very progressive governor in New York. His name's Andrew Cuomo. And yeah, right, Bernadette, there you go. You and I are connecting after this conference. That's for sure. Going to do a lot of hugging tonight. But so we have a very progressive governor. He had realized, and most of you know Buffalo, and you have certain perceptions of Buffalo. It's 1.1 million people in the Erie, Niagara counties, and there's about 260,000 people in a very dense city center, right? And for 70 years, it had, a lot of economic blight. It was a very dense manufacturing community, lost a lot of jobs. We had lost a culture of entrepreneurism over a span of 70, 75 years. But so many cultural assets and so much great industry, we were the original city of light. So if you think just about clean energy coming out of the Niagara Falls and putting light bulbs in downtown Buffalo, it started in Buffalo, right? So we were the original Silicon Valley, if you will. The reality is we gave
Detroit's going to fight you on that one.
What's that?
Detroit's going to fight you on that one.
Detroit's our partner in crime, for crying out loud. But nevertheless, so the governor wanted to make a statement, right? So he said, we're going to revitalize this city center. And he got through our legislature $1 billion of investment for economic development. And a portion of that money went to rebuilding an inclusive culture of entrepreneurism in our community. And as a result, we've taken the money and built out certain strategies recommended by the Brookings Institute or McKinsey or the Kauffman Foundation, et cetera. And we started building programming around how to deploy that capital. And it kicked off with a $5 million startup competition in the city of Buffalo. We award $5 million to 8 companies that hail from around the world, mostly in North America. And so some of the entrepreneurs I would expect to be in that competition I'd seen here today, and which would be great. But we do very intentional outreach to an inclusive set of entrepreneurs from around North America. We reach out to them, whether it's coming to the Aspen Institute or engaging with organizations from around the country to find great entrepreneurs that can become applicants. This year, and alongside that, which is scalable tech companies, the life sciences, consumer products, etc., alongside of that, we developed another program because we had garnered a very good brand for being a great competition. We're going to be launching our 5th one in January. That we built out a Western New York startup competition exclusively for minority founders and founders of diverse backgrounds. And because the state was the seed money, if you will, in our initiative, the local community galvanized around that, was catalyzed around that to actually create this inclusive Western New York-based competition, which is solely funded by the private sector, which we're really proud of. So out of 15 companies that we made investments in or chose for investments, if memory serves, it was 8 men, 7 female, and it was 4 Caucasian, 7 African American, and 5 minority, other than the Caucasian or African American. So, but how did that work? It was intentional. We show up to churches. We show up, if social media, if Snapchat isn't relevant on the east side neighborhoods, then we'll put posters in bus stops. So you have to go where the puck is, right? You got to reach on the terms of the people that you're trying to connect with. And that may look very different from one demographic to the next, but I'm proud to say that we're finally making some real traction, I believe. And it started, and I'm sorry to see that the deputy mayor is no longer here.
I think she's just on the other side of the door. I hope she comes back.
She knows all about you.
But quite frankly, it was catalyzed by the government, and now the private sector is starting to take over.
Great. So, Stephanie, talk to me a little bit about that, because you are a private sector entity. What does the government need to, local government, state government, because the benefit of DC is it's all in one. What does local and state government need to do to tee up the kinds of deals or the kinds of culture or the kinds of awareness that you and Impact America Fund can kind of amplify and draw on?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in terms of sort of public-private partnerships, but I will say some of the ways where I've seen results in sort of a more connected ecosystem is being able to tap into organizations such as TechCo, working with MAC. I've evaluated some of the applications that come through to give him more of a sense of what we look for in terms of what companies are investable at the level that we're looking at. And by the way, we're typically investing late seed stage, pre-Series A, about 12 to 18 months out. So, similar to Invest Detroit, we're thinking about how to be a bridge towards more traditional VC money that is typically hard to come by. And so how are we translating opportunities that we're seeing in underserved communities and bringing them into more of a mainstream conversation around longer term funding? For us, we also are connecting with local organizations that are on the ground. They understand what's happening, what are some of the big issues. They're also very connected to the entrepreneurs themselves. And so for those who have a tech element to the work that they're doing, we automatically become plugged into those individuals to make sure that we understand what the pipeline looks like. And a lot of times, we'll cut a check for a company, but it's after we've tracked them for a while. We want to get to know the entrepreneurs. We want to see that discipline around, how they're able to evolve in their thinking and learning as they're iterating on their business models. We also want to make sure the relationship is the right fit We want to make sure that our dollars, because they are small, we're a $10 million fund. Our check sizes are, about $200, $250 to start. And for us, that it's catalytic, but it's not going to be enough when you're thinking about these Series A, Series B types of funding. And so, how can we be strategic in supporting them in ways that are not necessarily monetary, but are ones that can connect them to larger groups of resources, whether it's around hiring the right talent, whether it's around how to operationalize their business, whether it is expanding the pool of capital that they're looking at. A lot of times we have entrepreneurs who are very conscious around how their models are impacting community, but they're not thinking about how to talk about that impact narrative to impact investors or people who are in the social impact space who have dollars to bring to the table. When we're thinking about institutions, tied to government, we're thinking about potential funders of our own, fund. We have to be supported institutionally with dollars to be able to deploy that capital. And so how do we bring those pools of capital to the table who can take on more of that risk, who understand that they need to be market makers but may not know how to find the right entrepreneurs? Well, we are the ones who can find entrepreneurs, so we tell them, give us access to your capital and we'll know how to deploy it in the right way. And I think Mac's model is one example of that. We're building and finding more limited partners for our fund to be a bigger example of that, but we had to put a stake in the ground somewhere. And I think what we're learning in the private sector, as we have more of these types of convenings, we want to be able to share out what we're learning so that public and private can work better together.
Great. So, Mac, in some sense, you are the government because
we are the government.
You are the government.
It's a big title.
But do you work with cities? Or county level governments in Maryland? And if so, what do you tell them about the kinds of local culture that they can be creating and supporting?
So that's interesting, right? So TEDCO being the largest funder of early stage tech companies, and we're technically an economic development firm ourselves, right? So we go to all the economic development firm conferences and we know all these folks. And more, they're coming to us asking us, okay, we see tech's growing, this is something we need to be a part of. How do we grow that? What do we do? And so we're very intentional about helping other places around the state. We have a grant set aside for different counties around the state of Maryland to start incubators. So if you're launching an incubator, you can get money from TEDCO, whether it be a grant or a reverse, a grant that you can pay back to different counties around the state. We also give them money for events all around the state. We have a program called our Rural Business Innovation Initiative, where we specifically have mentors set aside in the different rural parts of the state of Maryland to help those entrepreneurs, right? Because the kind of technologies you see coming out of Southern and Western Maryland look very different than the technologies you see coming from Central Maryland, right? And so we are very intentional about doing that. And when we do that, we partner with those other parts of the state, those other economic development corporations. But then there's this other thing, right, where when you look at my fund, we take in applications from all over the state of Maryland. And a lot of these economic development firms have money set aside to do really creative things with low interest loans and have just money sitting around to help grow economic development, right? Well, we're starting to have the conversation now about how could they repurpose that to maybe leverage that towards some of the companies that come through our program. Like in Prince George's County right now, they have a pool of money set aside. So I'm like, hey, we have 2 entrepreneurs from Prince George's County who got funding from our program. Why don't you take an additional $20K out of your fund and give each one of them an extra $10,000? Well, that's an easy thing and an easy win for that economic development firm. It's not a heavy lift, right? And that starts the conversation. And we're starting to have more and more of those conversations.
One of the things that Melissa has been sharp about keeping us focused on is what counts as a subsidy and who gets a subsidy. And I didn't want to tweet it, but I'm thinking about how hard Baltimore and Montgomery County and DC are running after Amazon's headquarters. And I understand that there are very good reasons to do that because Seattle was a burnt out industrial town before tech took root there. So I get it, but I do think it's really interesting to think about the abundance of money for some actors and the smaller, much smaller amounts of money that can leverage really important outcomes in the high growth space. And again, I understand why places are going after Amazon, but there's some kind of money that it's easy for places to put on the table and some kind of money that might be a lot harder for places to put on the table. And I think, I would hope that the cities that don't attract Amazon would kind of look at how much money they were going to put on the table and see if they could use it in other kind of generative and creative ways. Patty, quickly for you, when you talk to Detroit, the government of Detroit and economic development entities, what are you telling them that you need for your own pipeline?
So there are three things that are really critical to, I think, success for entrepreneurship, not only in Detroit, but the region in general. Capital, no question. Just as much as the entrepreneurs want capital, we need capital to deploy. And there's certainly, we don't, unfortunately, have the $1 billion that New York does. So capital is one. Really and Pam alluded to this earlier, a really strong network of talent that mentors our companies. So we've got great technology in Michigan. We've got a lot of large research institutions. We've got, I think, the most engineers, scientists per capita. I mean, it's crazy. We've got a lot of tech talent. But when it comes to marketing and sales, when it comes to scaling a business from 100 to 1,000 employees, we don't have that experience that's clamoring out of the woodwork to help our company. So we need more of that expertise added on, and then that investment really in the early stage entrepreneurs. So it takes time. So working on a company for 3 years before you're fundable is not a really long amount of time in reality. I know we hear these stories and we watch Silicon Valley and think that it should be a napkin and we're going to get $1 million, but it really doesn't work that way. It really takes most entrepreneurs a lot of hard work, a lot of sweat, a lot of tears before they finally actually get to that first investment. So really making sure we have the programs that are supporting them, helping them build the knowledge, build the network, and help them speak the language. That really is a foundation that has to be invested in.
Thank you. So I was an English major, and I'm just struck by never has a city profited so much from simple alliteration as Buffalo, right? $1 billion, right? If you started with an M, it would only have been $1 million, but you got the big bucks because of the B. Give me 2 non-financial things that government can do to support a culture of entrepreneurship, right? Because not everybody, as Patty said, is going to get the $1 billion. But what's 2 things that you think can support your work that are not dollar signs?
Well, I think, by the way, I want to go back to the billion just for a moment. It's unlocked $20 billion from the public sector. Just so we're clear.
From the public sector or from the private sector?
Or private sector. So another $20 billion has come on from the private sector. But it was the ignition that unlocked and catalyzed an entire renaissance, which is now far more collaborative, right? So, but somebody had to do it. Somebody had to place the bets first, right? And it turned out to be the state. What else can we do? I think building awareness is a really critical part, and also not only building awareness, but I love the discussion around educating and making sure that we have the right people surrounding young entrepreneurs or new entrepreneurs. It's really tough. I've had a bunch of them myself. Before I landed at 43 North, I had 5, and just like you guys, I was crying, trying to figure out new ways of tears and staying up till 1 in the morning every day, and put the babies down to bed, and then it was every single night till 12, 1 o'clock in the morning. It's no different. And it's tough, but we can be empathic to each other, But the reality is that's just the way it is, right? Here's the issue. Number one, it is a viable way to create opportunities for yourselves and for your families. It is. That's the reality, but most people don't even know that it even exists, that the opportunities really exists. I can't presume to go into any of the neighborhoods or 10 different neighborhoods in my community and know how to fix their problems or address their challenges, but certainly the people that hail from those neighborhoods could do that if they were aware enough and had the means, potentially the means, to be able to go address those problems. So we spend a lot of time with the government and the private sector to create awareness. Last year we engaged with 4,000 high school students, most of them coming from neighborhoods, from underprivileged neighborhoods. But here's the other side of the coin. Not everybody should be an entrepreneur. That's the reality. Like, everybody wants money and everybody thinks, yeah, it's hard, it's frustrating, you're gonna cry, you're gonna get burnt out, you're gonna yada, yada, yada. It's life. But educating and surrounding aspiring entrepreneurs with the right resources and collaborating and connecting and networking, not even just within the community, but being here. Melissa asked me why I was here, and I'm very grateful that I was the only white dude on this, out of all the panels, by the way. Let the record be shown. But it is collaborating among each other, right? That in Steve Case, one of your favorite sons from the DC area, one of United States' greatest entrepreneurs, right? Rise to the Rest and Case Foundation, etc. He said the next wave, has anybody read The Third Wave? Hopefully everybody in this room has read The Third Wave, and it came from one of your own. But the next wave of innovation is going to be coming out of new collaborations and new partnerships. So it isn't just a DC issue, but it's connecting with Invest Detroit, or Mac and I getting together and talking about what's working in Maryland, and seeing whether or not there's any synergies in Western New York, or Invest America, like whether it's in Oakland or Buffalo, it's still a problem, right? Inclusivity, and if we're going to optimize the true potential of our neighborhoods, our communities, and this country, then we need to really optimize the true potential of all people. So, and I don't think any one community, frankly, is going to be able to solve this problem. I think that it is going to have to be a far more holistic, initiative. So how about that for a quick answer?
That's good. That's good. But now I'm going to be tougher than I normally am. I always say that.
Seems so nice. You're an English teacher.
English major.
English major.
I teach other things, I hope. But this notion, what's the one thing that people, one sentence, the one thing that you want people to leave this panel, to leave this room with? Stephanie, we'll start with you.
I would say for funders in particular, if you're mission driven, then it's a requirement that you feel build. So not just thinking about the silo that you occupy with your work, but extending outward from that and really understanding the ripple effects and how to really be a part of creating the right ecosystem that can make everything work. Because we can for our fund, we can focus specifically in sort of this late seed stage, but I need to understand what's happening at pre-seed and early seed, and then even behind us at Series A and B, and being able to get these companies to successfully graduate to the different stages of growth that they want to realize for their ventures. So I think we need to continuously think about the impact we're making in our own silo, but then how that expands out beyond us for the broader ecosystem itself.
John, one sentence.
If you're an ecosystem builder, be intentional. If you're an entrepreneur, go unafraid. You have one life. Make it work. Go unafraid. And I'm speaking directly to the one that said that it was really hard. Go unafraid. This is it. You got it. You seem really bright to me. And Bernadette, same thing. Well, she's not afraid, and you're clearly not afraid. Go unafraid.
Okay, Patty.
So I'm going to be a little provocative. We haven't talked about this, but I would argue that the current startup funding model is broken. We can fund microloans, and we can fund really super high-tech VC, but we can't fund the in-between. And they're models that have to be built to support good, strong growth companies that have impact in our communities and our regions that will be wonderful companies, but we don't have the funding model that exists today.
What is that range, just out of curiosity, in your mind? When you say that, what are the boundaries?
I would say it's probably somewhere between 300 and 2 million.
If only there was a place at the Aspen Institute that did research on funding models and options, and if only there were a funder in the room who had a relationship with them and that could fund that research. That'd be amazing. Mac, what you got?
So that's funny because Patty took what I was going to say, right? But really, if you're a funder, venture capital investing has been done the same way for a really long time with the same model. There are other ways to do it. And I don't know if those models exist yet or if people have tried them yet, but why aren't we trying different models? Why aren't we trying different ways of investing, different thoughts around it? I'd like to see more people come together and just come up with different ideas on how to run a venture firm. Or maybe you don't call it venture, maybe call it something else. But there are other models, there's other ways to do it. For earlier stage companies, for later stage companies, for all sectors of venture and investing, why has it been done the same way for so long?
That's great. So Deputy Mayor Snowden was supposed to give some closing remarks, but I think she was so full of excitement and energy and new ideas that she just could not wait. She had to run back and tell mayor and council that she has got it figured out and they just need to start implementing. So I'm sure tomorrow we're going to hear all about that. But one of the things that I think has come through is something that Patty and Matt really just crystallized for us, which is for a field that tells a story about itself, that it is disruptive, that it is brave and crazy and courageous. It has relied too long on old patterns. And it's time for venture to, in some ways, take itself more seriously about breaking old models and busting boundaries and doing the things that are truly new and truly creative and truly original. So I appreciate this panel for bringing that to light. I also think that we have successfully convinced anyone who might have been a skeptic that DC has extraordinary entrepreneurial talent, that the city is solving problems that matter, and that just because we are not currently one of the hotspots for venture capital, that just means there are more opportunities for, again, brave and bold investors. And I appreciate that people in this room have heard about the importance of collaboration and coming together, because that is what is going to drive an ecosystem, and that's what's going to make what happened today have resonance outside this room, I hope, for these companies and for generation after generation of companies and entrepreneurs in the city. So thank you so much. I think we still have some more food, so please, more business cards, more deals, more talking, and thanks again. Really appreciate it.